Hello there, and welcome to the Mad Human Channel, your quiet corner of the mind where curiosity meets calm, and science gently rocks you into a state of rest. Tonight, we're not drifting through the stars or wading through ancient oceans, but instead, we're diving inward, into the intricate, uncharted universe inside your head. A universe where tiny pulses of electricity and fleeting chemical whispers weave together into something far more mysterious than thought alone. Emotion. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? I'd love to know in the comments, because it always amazes me how these soft journeys connect us across continents and time zones. And if you find yourself lulled by tonight's exploration, feel free to leave a gentle like, maybe subscribe, so you can join us again when curiosity calls you back. Now, close your eyes if you wish. Loosen the tightness in your shoulders. Let your breath find its rhythm. Not hurried, not shallow, just steady, like the quiet pulse of the earth itself. Tonight's path won't take us across great distances of space, but it will take us deep into the neural landscapes that shape the way you experience the world. The brain that feels is not the same as the brain that reasons, although the two are intertwined like roots and branches of the same ancient tree. This is a journey through that root system, through the silent pathways where sensation turns into meaning, where a heartbeat can quicken at a glance, where tears can form without words. Imagine your mind as a vast city at night. Billions of lights, each one a neuron, connected by invisible threads of possibility. Most of the city hums along in steady patterns, predictable flows of traffic and electricity. But in the emotional quarters, deep in neighborhoods like the amygdala, the insula, and the prefrontal cortex, things change in an instant. A single spark can ripple through entire districts, lighting streets you haven't walked in years. The amygdala, small and almond-shaped, is one of the city's sentinels. It waits, alert to the faintest hint of threat or promise, scanning your inner horizon for what matters most. When it catches something, a familiar face, an unexpected sound, the shift in someone's voice, it sends signals surging outward, quick and undeniable. The insula, quieter but no less vital, listens to the symphony of your own body, the flutter in your stomach, the tension in your jaw, the warmth spreading in your chest, and translates them into a language the rest of your brain can understand. Together, these regions do not simply react. They create. They weave sensations and memories into something more, into joy, fear, longing, grief, love. And what's remarkable is that every emotion you've ever felt has followed this hidden choreography. Think about the first time you felt real awe. Maybe standing beneath a night sky so wide and deep it seemed to press against your skin. Or the quiet ache of missing someone you love when their absence feels louder than any sound. In those moments, your brain was not merely processing input. It was composing something personal, something only you could feel in exactly that way. These emotions are not random. They are shaped by the long river of your life, by the things you've seen, the words you've heard, the silences you've endured, and the comforts you've known. They rise not just from present circumstances, but from the sediment of memory, from layers upon layers of lived experience, carried forward in the architecture of your nervous system. And just as rivers carve valleys over centuries, your emotional pathways shape how you meet the world tomorrow. Some grooves grow deep, carrying familiar currents. The smile that comes easily, the anger that flares without warning, the sadness that lingers in certain light. But even the deepest grooves are not destiny. The brain that feels is also the brain that changes. New pathways can be formed, new bridges built, old circuits quieted. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, means that your emotional landscape is alive, not fixed. The way you feel today is not the way you must always feel. This is part of what makes emotions so extraordinary. They are both ancient and fluid. The architecture of feeling has been sculpted by millions of years of evolution. Yet in the space of a single breath, it can shift, soften, or ignite. You are the heir to that architecture, but also its ongoing builder. As you listen now, perhaps you can imagine your emotions as weather patterns moving through that great inner city. Some arrive suddenly, a summer storm spilling over the rooftops of your thoughts. Others creep in slowly, like mist curling through streets at dawn. And always, there is the sky above, vast, constant, the awareness that holds it all. Your awareness is not the storm. It is not even the mist. It is the space in which these things happen, the quiet vantage point from which you can see a feeling rise and fall. And yet, you are not separate from it. You are the city and the sky, the lights and the darkness between them, the pulse of electricity and the stillness that frames it. Somewhere deep within, there is a rhythm, not unlike a heartbeat, that underlies every emotion. It is the steady reminder that you are alive, that you can feel it all. And in that, there is something profoundly beautiful. Let us continue, because if you truly sit with this, you'll realize emotions are not interruptions to life. They are life. They are the colors on the canvas, the texture of the air, the very waves that move through the ocean of your mind. Without them, your days would be outlines with no shading, notes with no melody, steps with no rhythm. The brain's genius lies in its ability to take a collection of electrical impulses and chemical messengers, mix them with the memory of who you've been, and produce something so complex, so deeply felt, that it can bring you to your knees or lift you to a horizon you didn't know you could see. Imagine a moment where you're watching a sunset, not just seeing it, but feeling it. The warm gold spilling into deep purple isn't just a scene. It's a conversation between your senses and your memory, between the light hitting your retina and the echoes of 100 other sunsets your mind has stored. Your amygdala stirs, not because it detects danger, but because it recognizes significance. Your prefrontal cortex begins to weave thoughts. This is beautiful, this is fleeting, this reminds me of home. Your insula registers the subtle warmth in your chest, the deepening of your breath, the quiet hum of being alive. And in that moment, the emotion of awe blooms. Not from the sunset itself, but from the meaning you've layered onto it through a lifetime of moments. But emotions are not only born in beauty. They are born in the shadows, too. Think of fear, how it can rise before you've even named it. You hear the creak of a floorboard in the dark, and before your conscious mind has processed it, your heart is pounding. That's your brain's survival system, older than language, older than civilization itself, responding in milliseconds to what it thinks might be danger. That rush of adrenaline, the tightening in your stomach, the widening of your eyes, all of it orchestrated to prepare you for action. And yet, fear can be born from imagination alone. A memory of loss can summon grief so real it aches in your bones, even if the person you're thinking of is long gone. A vision of what could happen can send a ripple of anxiety through your day before anything has actually occurred. This is the paradox of the emotional brain. It reacts to reality, but it also reacts to possibility. Your neurons fire in patterns that can't distinguish between what is unfolding and what is imagined, because in evolutionary terms, preparing for a danger that might never come was safer than ignoring a danger that was already there. Love, too, is not merely a feeling. It's a tapestry woven from countless emotional threads. It's the comfort of familiarity braided with the spark of novelty, the relief of safety intertwined with the thrill of vulnerability. When you hold someone's hand, your somatosensory cortex registers the touch, your oxytocin levels rise, your dopamine pathways light up. But those are just the ingredients. The recipe, the way it feels, comes from you, from the stories you've lived and the meaning you've given to that connection. And this is where the emotional brain is perhaps most magical. It doesn't just react to the world. It creates worlds. The same neural machinery that responds to loss can also paint joy in vivid colors. The same circuits that register threat can also recognize beauty. Every emotion you feel is a blend of ancient survival instincts and the uniquely human ability to imagine, to remember, to hope. This is why two people can stand in the same place, hear the same song, and feel completely different things, because the song is not the source of the emotion. The listener is. And so, the brain that feels is an artist, a storyteller, a mapmaker of the inner world. It sketches rivers of joy, carves valleys of sorrow, builds mountains of pride and meadows of peace. And just like landscapes in nature, these emotional terrains shift. A place that once held only pain can become a place of growth. A song that once made you ache can become one that makes you smile. Your brain's plasticity means you can revisit these emotional places and see them differently, Not because the facts have changed, but because you have. And the most extraordinary part? You don't need to wait for life to hand you certain conditions to feel a certain way. The very act of paying attention, of noticing, can reshape how emotions arise in you. Just as a scientist observes without interfering, you can notice a feeling without being swallowed by it. That noticing is the first step toward shaping it. They are messages, whispered or shouted, that carry meaning from the depths of your inner world to the surface of your awareness. A flicker of unease before a decision, a swell of warmth when you meet someone's gaze, a sudden rush of energy at the edge of a challenge. Each of these is a kind of letter from your nervous system, sealed with the signature of millions of years of evolution. The trouble is, we often treat emotions as if they are problems to be solved or flaws to be fixed, rather than signals to be understood. When fear rises, we may try to push it away instead of asking what it's pointing toward. When sadness settles in, we may try to drown it in noise rather than listening to what it's trying to tell us about what we value and miss. And yet, the brain's emotional machinery is designed not only to react, but to teach. Every surge of feeling leaves behind a subtle imprint. A neural pathway strengthened or softened, a lesson stored in the circuitry of experience. The amygdala and hippocampus work in tandem here. The amygdala coloring events with emotional weight, and the hippocampus tucking them into the library of memory, where they will later shape the way you interpret the world. It's why a song can bring you to tears years after you last heard it. Why the smell of a certain spice can send you back to your grandmother's kitchen in an instant. In those moments, the brain is not simply recalling a fact. It is reawakening the emotional context of that memory, flooding your present with echoes of your past. And this, in turn, affects the future because every time you feel, remember, and respond, you are training your brain in what to expect next. This is the quiet feedback loop of the emotional mind. Experience shapes emotion, emotion shapes perception, and perception shapes the next experience. Left unseen, this loop can keep you circling in the same emotional weather patterns for years. But with awareness, you can begin to shift the winds. Experience shapes emotion, emotion shapes perception, and perception shapes the next experience. And so the cycle turns like an endless wheel, spinning silently in the background of your life. And yet, if you pause and look closely, you can begin to see that you are not simply a passenger caught on this wheel. You are also, in ways subtle but profound, its mechanic and its navigator capable of oiling the gears, shifting its rhythm, even changing its direction. Consider for a moment the way your brain's neural pathways form over time. Each time you react with anger to a familiar trigger, you strengthen the neural connection that makes anger the default for that kind of moment. Each time you meet that same situation with curiosity instead of hostility, you start to lay down a new path, one that your brain will remember and reach for in the future. This is not just theory. This is the living, rewiring capacity of neuroplasticity, the same biological gift that allows a stroke patient to relearn speech or a pianist to adapt to new hand movements after injury. And in the emotional realm, it means you can, through awareness and practice, reshape how your brain interprets and responds to life. But to do this, you must first learn to speak the language of emotion. And this is no small task, for emotions do not arrive as neatly labeled packages. They come as sensations in the body, as changes in breathing, in posture, in thought speed, sometimes as subtle as a faint pressure in the chest or a strange hollowness in the stomach, other times as overwhelming as a tidal wave breaking over the shore. The insula, often called the brain's interoceptive hub, plays a central role here, translating bodily sensations into the beginnings of emotional awareness, the flutter of excitement, the burn of shame, the heaviness of grief. From there, the signals are passed to other brain regions, where they are interpreted and given meaning, and this meaning is what turns raw sensation into a feeling you can name. Yet, meaning is not objective, it is filtered through your personal history, your culture, your beliefs, your expectations. Two people can feel the exact same physiological changes. A racing heart, sweaty palms, rapid breathing, and one will call it fear while the other calls it exhilaration. And the difference lies not in the body's reaction but in the story the brain tells about it. This storytelling function, rooted in the prefrontal cortex, is one of the most powerful aspects of human emotion. The brain does not simply record reality, it interprets it, and in doing so, shapes your emotional landscape. This is why reframing is so transformative. Changing the story changes the feeling, and changing the feeling changes the choices you make next. But the brain that feels is not just a storyteller. It is also a historian, keeping archives of every emotional moment you've lived, whether or not you consciously remember them. The hippocampus, with its delicate, seahorse-like structure, holds vast collections of your life's sensory and emotional details, ready to be activated when a sight, sound, or smell matches something from the past. And when it does, the past can feel as vivid as the present, which is both a gift and a burden. It is the reason nostalgia can wrap you in warmth, and also the reason trauma can replay in sharp detail years after the event. Your brain's emotional circuitry does not know the difference between then and now the way your logical mind does. To it, activation is activation, and that is why healing requires more than simply thinking differently. It requires creating new emotional experiences that can overwrite or soften the old. These new experiences are not created in grand, cinematic moments alone. They are built in small, repeated acts of awareness and choice, noticing the calm that comes after deep breathing, savoring the safety of a kind friend's presence, allowing yourself to fully feel joy without bracing for its loss. Over time, these moments accumulate, just as grooves in a riverbed deepen with each passing stream, until the water of your emotions flows in a new direction almost effortlessly. And here lies another mystery. Emotions are not just private phenomena inside your skull. They are also profoundly social. The human brain evolved in community, shaped by the need to read and respond to others' emotional signals quickly and accurately. The mirror neuron system, scattered throughout areas like the premotor cortex and inferior parietal lobule, allows you to mirror the emotions you see in others, not just by guessing them intellectually, but by actually simulating them in your own nervous system. When you see someone smile genuinely, your brain's reward circuits light up as if you were smiling yourself. When you witness someone in pain, areas associated with your own pain experience activate. This empathic resonance is the glue of human connection, and yet, it also means your emotional state is porous, influenced by the moods and energies of those around you, sometimes without you realizing it. Emotional contagion can spread through a crowd in seconds, just as fear can ripple through a flock of birds or a school of fish, and your brain's survival wiring is tuned to detect and align with these group emotions because, for most of our species' history, being in sync with the group meant staying alive. Today, this wiring still serves us in moments of connection and solidarity, but it can also pull us into collective anxiety, outrage, or despair, especially in our hyper-connected world where the group can be millions of people online. Understanding this porousness is key to emotional self-care. It reminds you to choose your environments, your conversations, your media diet with the same care you would choose the air you breathe, for the emotional atmosphere you inhabit will shape your brain as surely as oxygen shapes your lungs. But while our emotions are influenced from the outside, they are also deeply regulated from the inside, and this regulation is perhaps the most delicate balancing act the brain performs. The limbic system, with its ancient survival drives, often urges immediate action, fight, flee, freeze, while the prefrontal cortex, the newer, reasoning part of the brain, tries to weigh long-term consequences, social norms, personal values. When these two systems work in harmony, you can feel deeply without being swept away. When they are in conflict, you may act in ways you later regret or feel paralyzed when you most need to act. Training this harmony is the essence of emotional intelligence, the ability to sense what you're feeling, understand why you're feeling it, and choose how to respond in alignment with your deeper intentions. Practices like mindfulness meditation, cognitive reframing, journaling, and even certain forms of therapy work by strengthening the pathways between the emotional centers and the prefrontal cortex, making it easier to notice an emotion in the moment and choose your next move consciously. And yet, even with this training, emotions will sometimes surprise you, arriving with a force that sweeps away all preparation. And this is not failure, this is the nature of being human. The goal is not to never be caught in the storm. The goal is to learn how to find your footing in it, to trust that the sky above is still there, vast and unbroken, even when the clouds are thick. And in this trust, a new relationship with emotion emerges. One where feelings are not enemies or dictators, but companions on the road, some gentle, some challenging, all carrying information you would not otherwise have. The more you listen, the more fluent you become in their language, and the more you realize that the brain that feels is not separate from the brain that thinks, but is, in fact, its partner in every decision, every dream, every act of courage or kindness you've ever taken. And as you breathe into this truth, perhaps you can sense the quiet revolution it offers, that by learning to feel well, you learn to live well, and that the landscapes of your inner world, no matter how tangled or weather-worn, can always be tended, reshaped, and walked anew. And as you walk these inner landscapes with more awareness, you start to notice the patterns. The hills you climb again and again, the valleys you sink into without meaning to, the sudden clearings where light pours in, unexpectedly. And this noticing is not just observation, it is participation, because by paying attention you change the terrain itself. The act of awareness strengthens neural pathways that allow you to pause before reacting, to take in more of the present moment before your brain jumps to old conclusions. In this way, the emotional mind becomes less like an untamed wild and more like a cultivated garden. Still alive, still growing, still subject to weather, but shaped with care and intention. And here's the remarkable thing. The seeds you plant in this garden are often small, almost invisible acts. Choosing to breathe deeply before replying to an upsetting message. Pausing to feel gratitude for the warmth of sunlight on your face. Letting yourself cry without judgment when sadness arrives. Each of these moments is a seed, and with repetition, they grow into living pathways in your brain, altering not just how you feel in the moment, but how you are able to feel in the future. Modern neuroscience has shown that the brain responds to imagined experiences much like it does to real ones, which means you can rehearse emotions in your mind, building familiarity and skill before you ever need them in life. This is why visualizing calm during stress or picturing yourself responding with compassion in a conflict can, over time, make those responses more natural when the moment comes. Your brain is a prediction machine, always trying to guess what will happen next and preparing you for it. And by feeding it new patterns, you can gently teach it to expect more peace, more connection, more resilience. Yet this reshaping of the emotional brain is not about forcing constant positivity. It's about creating capacity, about making room for the full spectrum of human feeling without becoming trapped in any one part of it. Just as a skilled sailor learns not to control the wind but to work with it, you can learn to navigate the shifting currents of emotion with skill, allowing joy to fill your sails, letting sorrow slow you into stillness when needed, steering carefully through anger's storms, and resting in the calm that follows. And as you grow in this capacity, you begin to see that emotions are not obstacles to a clear mind. They are the colors, textures, and rhythms that make clarity meaningful. Without them, decisions would be cold calculations, stripped of the very qualities that make life worth living. Even fear, often maligned as an enemy, serves a vital role in sharpening your senses and focusing your energy when survival, physical or emotional, is at stake. Even grief, heavy as it feels, is proof of love, proof that something mattered enough to leave an imprint. And joy, fleeting as it may be, is the brain's way of telling you, this is good, remember this, seek this again. Each emotion is a compass point in its own way, helping you orient toward the things that matter most. And the more you learn to read these signals without being overwhelmed by them, the more skillfully you can navigate both the storms and the still waters of your inner world. Over time, you come to understand that the brain that feels is not a weakness to be overcome or a puzzle to be solved, but a living, breathing partner in the ongoing creation of your life. One that remembers your past, shapes your present, and whispers possibilities for your future in a language made of sensation, memory, and meaning. And when you begin to live with this understanding, something subtle but profound shifts. Instead of bracing yourself against emotions, you start meeting them at the door, even the ones you used to fear, because you've learned that they are not invaders but messengers, and each carries a truth about who you are, what you value, and how you're connected to the world around you. This doesn't mean that every feeling is correct in its assumptions. Fear can overestimate danger. Shame can speak in the exaggerated voice of old wounds. Anger can flare from misunderstandings. But even then, the emotion is a signal worth decoding, because beneath the distortion there is often a core need or a past hurt calling for your attention. When you approach feelings this way, the brain's emotional architecture begins to work with you rather than against you. The amygdala's alarms still sound, but you've learned to check the validity of the threat before reacting. The insula still sends you the trembling of anxiety or the warmth of affection, But you've learned to pair these sensations with awareness, to ask, what is this telling me right now? Instead of being swept away. Over time, the prefrontal cortex grows more adept at integrating these signals, weaving emotional insight into reasoned choice, and what once felt like an internal battle becomes more like a council meeting where every voice is heard but no single one dominates without question. And perhaps the most beautiful change of all is that you begin to notice emotions as they arise, not just when they've already consumed you, the moment before frustration builds, the first gentle tug of sadness before it deepens, the early sparkle of joy before it overflows. In these early moments lies immense power, for it is here you can choose to nurture a feeling, to let it pass, or to explore it more deeply. It is here that emotional mastery is born, not from suppression, but from conscious participation. And as the skill grows, your emotional life becomes less about reacting to the world and more about creating a relationship with it, shaping your inner responses in ways that reflect your truest self. You start to see that emotions are not just reactions to what happens to you. They are also invitations to step more fully into life, to engage with it not as a detached observer but as a vibrant participant. Even the most difficult feelings can be doorways, if you are willing to walk through them. Fear can lead you toward courage, grief toward love's depth, anger toward the defense of what matters, and joy toward gratitude. The brain that feels is not an accident of biology. It is a masterpiece of evolution, a living testament to the fact that to be human is not merely to think, but to feel, and to let those feelings guide you toward a life that is rich, connected, and fully alive. And the more you live in alignment with this truth, the more you begin to sense that emotions are not isolated flashes of experience but threads in a much larger tapestry. A tapestry woven from every interaction, every memory, every dream, every hope you've ever carried. Each feeling, whether light or heavy, bright or shadowed, is a colored strand, and the way you meet it determines how it integrates into the fabric of your life. When you meet joy with openness, its golden thread strengthens and shines, connecting to moments past and moments yet to come. When you meet grief with tenderness, its deep indigo thread settles into the weave, bringing depth and contrast without tearing the cloth. The emotional brain is constantly weaving like this, moment by moment, even when you're not aware of it. The amygdala lays the initial color, the hippocampus stitches it to memory, the prefrontal cortex decides where in the pattern it will belong, and together they create something that is both utterly personal and deeply universal. This is why stories, music, and art can stir emotions across cultures and generations, because beneath our differences, the machinery of feeling is shared, tuned to recognize the patterns of love, loss, hope, and awe. And in understanding this shared foundation, empathy becomes not just a skill but a natural state of being. When you hear another's story, your mirror neurons light up, your body simulates their feelings, and for a moment you live in their world. This ability to feel with is not weakness. It is one of our greatest strengths, for it builds connection, trust, and cooperation, the very qualities that have allowed humanity to survive and thrive. Yet, empathy must be balanced, for the same openness that allows you to feel another's joy can also leave you vulnerable to carrying their pain as if it were your own. Here, emotional boundaries become as important as emotional openness, learning when to step in and when to step back, when to listen deeply and when to rest. The brain that feels thrives in this balance, in the rhythm of engagement and retreat, in the dance of connection and solitude. For just as muscles need both movement and rest to grow strong, your emotional system needs both expression and recovery to remain healthy. And so, tending to your emotional brain is not just about facing feelings when they arise, but also about creating the conditions in which they can flow naturally, without stagnating or overwhelming you. Time in nature, moments of stillness, meaningful conversations, creative expression, even the simple act of breathing deeply and slowly to signal safety to your nervous system. These are not luxuries. They are essential acts of maintenance for the intricate, beautiful, and sometimes stormy world within. And the more you honor this, the more your emotional life transforms from something you manage into something you inhabit fully. A living landscape you can explore, nurture, and even shape, knowing that every step you take changes not only how you feel today, but the very structure of the brain that will meet tomorrow. And when we look deeper into the currents that carry our feelings, we discover that they are not random at all, but woven from threads of memory, perception, and bodily sensation, each one influenced by the entire history of who we are, the relationships we've had, and the world we've moved through, so that a single moment of sadness might contain echoes of childhood disappointments, the sting of a friendship that faded, and even the subtle influence of a rainy afternoon that dampens our energy. While joy might surge from something as grand as a life-changing event or as small as the glint of sunlight on a familiar street. And the brain, in its ceaseless work, ties these together without our conscious awareness, creating the seamless fabric of what we feel. Here, the amygdala acts as a vigilant sentinel, scanning the environment for threats and opportunities, setting off the cascades of chemicals that prime the body for action, while the hippocampus retrieves context from the vast library of stored experiences, shaping not just what we feel, but why we feel it, and then the insula, that deep fold of cortex, translates all of this into a lived sensation. The feeling of tightness in your chest when you're anxious, the warm flush of pride when you've done something meaningful, or the hollow ache of loneliness when connection feels out of reach. Yet all of this unfolds so quickly, in fractions of a second, that we mistake emotions for being simple, immediate things, when in truth they are complex symphonies composed by many instruments playing in perfect, if invisible, coordination. And perhaps the most fascinating part is that this entire system evolved not for self-reflection, but for survival, to keep our ancestors alive in an unpredictable and often dangerous world. Meaning that the sadness that once helped a tribe bond after loss, or the fear that kept a hunter alert in the dark, is now triggered by a critical email from a boss or the silence of a friend who hasn't replied, showing that emotions are ancient tools now applied to modern problems. And this mismatch can lead to both the beauty and the burden of feeling, because while these emotions can still guide us toward connection, creativity, and empathy, they can also misfire, pushing us into anxiety, resentment, or despair when no real threat exists. Yet here lies the opportunity, for by understanding how the brain creates these states, we can learn to work with them instead of against them, to reinterpret the signals, to channel the energy of anger into constructive change, to let grief become a bridge to deeper compassion, to allow fear to sharpen our focus instead of shrinking our world. And in this process we begin to realize that emotions are not enemies to be conquered, but messages to be understood, allies that, when listened to carefully, can point us toward a richer, more connected life, because at their core, they are the brain's way of telling us what matters. And in learning their language, we not only discover more about ourselves but about the intricate, miraculous machinery of the mind that feels. As the layers of this emotional architecture unfold, it becomes clear that emotions are not just fleeting sensations but deeply embedded processes that guide our decisions, shape our relationships, and color our perception of reality, forming an internal compass that is part biological, part psychological, and part social. The amygdala, often referred to as the brain's emotional alarm system, does more than merely respond to threats. It works in concert with the hippocampus to bind emotional weight to memories, making sure that the scent of a certain perfume can send you tumbling back into the warmth of a childhood embrace or the sting of a painful breakup. And these emotional imprints are not random. They're survival tools forged by millions of years of evolution, teaching us what to seek and what to avoid. Yet, emotions are also sculpted by culture and personal experience, meaning the same stimulus can evoke vastly different feelings depending on one's upbringing, beliefs, and even current mood state, and herein lies the paradox of emotions. They are at once universal in structure and deeply individual in expression, creating a shared human language that no words can fully capture but everyone instinctively understands. Neurochemical messengers such as serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin form the molecular symphony that underpins our emotional states, with dopamine fueling the thrill of anticipation, serotonin stabilizing mood like a steady tide, and oxytocin weaving bonds of trust and intimacy between individuals, whether they are lovers, friends, or parent and child. And each of these chemicals doesn't operate in isolation but in intricate feedback loops, constantly adjusting in response to external events and internal narratives. The prefrontal cortex steps into this swirling mix as a sort of wise counselor, interpreting the amygdala's alarm signals, modulating impulsive reactions, and enabling more measured responses. Yet, under conditions of extreme stress, this counselor's voice can be drowned out, leading to rash decisions and heightened emotional reactivity, a design flaw from our evolutionary past where fast, decisive action meant survival. But in the modern world, where threats are rarely predators in the bushes, and more often deadlines, arguments, or financial strain, this ancient wiring can sometimes sabotage rather than save us, making emotional regulation a skill as essential as breathing. Mindfulness, cognitive reframing, and deep social connection have emerged as powerful tools to retrain the brain's emotional circuits, shifting the balance from reactive survival mode to a state of reflective awareness where emotions can be felt fully without overwhelming the mind. The fascinating thing is that our brains are not static. Neuroplasticity means that repeated emotional patterns, whether of gratitude, anxiety, or anger, literally reshape the connections between neurons, strengthening certain pathways while letting others wither. So by choosing where we place our attention and how we interpret our experiences, we can slowly sculpt the emotional landscape of our minds. This conscious shaping of emotion is not about suppression but integration, acknowledging fear without being ruled by it, feeling sadness without drowning in it, and embracing joy without clinging to it desperately, all of which aligns with ancient philosophies from Stoicism to Buddhism, which have long taught that peace comes not from controlling the world but from understanding and directing the mind. Yet, even as we master these skills, the mystery remains. Why does music, a mere arrangement of sound waves, have the power to evoke tears, chills, or a sense of transcendence? Why can a fleeting smile from a stranger lift our spirits for hours? Why do some memories glow with an emotional radiance that seems to defy the passage of decades? Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that emotions are not separate from thought, but the very fabric through which thought moves. And to understand emotions is not just to map neural circuits or measure hormone levels, but to glimpse the essence of being human, a tapestry woven of reason and feeling, survival and meaning, biology and poetry, each thread essential, each pattern unique, and each moment of feeling a reminder that we are alive in a universe vast enough to hold both the mysteries of the stars and the quiet truth of a tear rolling down a cheek. And as we go deeper into this invisible architecture of the mind, it becomes clear that emotions are not just random visitors knocking at the door of consciousness, but rather the very architects of experience, shaping our thoughts, perceptions, and actions in ways we often fail to recognize. For in the brain, there is no clear line between feeling and thinking. These processes bleed into each other like colors in a watercolor painting, each influencing and modifying the other until the original outlines are unrecognizable. And perhaps nowhere is this dance more apparent than in the amygdala, the almond-shaped sentinel buried deep within the temporal lobe, constantly scanning our internal and external environments for signs of threat or opportunity, triggering cascades of chemical signals that ripple through the hypothalamus, the brainstem, and the endocrine system, altering heart rate, breathing patterns, and even the subtle muscles of the face that broadcast our inner states to the world. Yet this is not an isolated drama, for the prefrontal cortex, seat of reason, planning, and reflection, steps in like a wise but sometimes hesitant judge, weighing the raw impulses of the limbic system against the learned wisdom of experience and social norms, deciding when to act on our emotional impulses and when to hold back. It is in this constant negotiation between emotional urgency and rational restraint that much of our human complexity resides. And this interplay is not static but sculpted moment by the neurochemistry of dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and oxytocin, each chemical messenger painting the mental canvas with different hues of desire, calm, vigilance, or bonding, so that love, for instance, is not merely a poetic abstraction but a tangible orchestration of oxytocin-fueled trust. Circuits, dopamine-driven reward anticipation, and serotonin-mediated mood stability, while fear is an urgent alarm blending adrenaline surges with heightened amygdala activity, priming the body for fight or flight. Yet even here, culture and personal history color the experience, for the same racing heart and trembling hands might be labeled excitement in one context and panic in another, reminding us that emotions are both biological universals and deeply personal narratives. And as neuroscientists peer into the living brain with fMRI and EEG, they are finding that emotions are not confined to discrete centers, but emerge from vast networks, with the insula weaving together interoceptive awareness, the subtle knowledge of what is happening in the body, with the narrative self, making feelings feel like they are ours, while the anterior cingulate cortex acts like a bridge between emotion and action, detecting conflicts, signaling urgency, and nudging us toward resolution. And all of this unfolds within fractions of a second, before conscious thought even has a chance to form, which is why we can be moved to tears by a piece of music before we can articulate why, or why a stranger's smile can lift our mood without us ever knowing their name. And perhaps the most humbling insight is that emotions are not glitches in the machinery of reason but the very fuel of it, for decision-making without emotion, as tragically demonstrated in patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, becomes paralyzed, devoid of value-based judgment, proving that to feel is to know what matters, and to know what matters is to be fully alive. So as we explore deeper into this realm, we must see emotions not as the opposite of logic but as its partner, co-creating the tapestry of human consciousness in every waking moment. And as these intricate patterns of brain activity continue to weave the fabric of our emotional lives, it becomes increasingly clear that emotions are not random storms passing through an otherwise calm mind, but are deeply embedded processes that guide perception, shape decision-making, and even influence the body's health in subtle yet profound ways. For every surge of joy or stab of fear carries with it a cascade of hormonal changes, shifts in breathing, fluctuations in heart rate, and tiny, muscular adjustments that together create the embodied experience of feeling. And when we examine this through the lens of neuroscience, we see that these processes rely on a delicate interplay between the limbic system, particularly structures like the amygdala and hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex, which together form a kind of emotional circuit where raw affective responses are generated, evaluated, and regulated. Yet this interplay is not static. It is sculpted continuously by our experiences, memories, and cultural conditioning, meaning that no two people feel exactly the same way in identical circumstances because their neural wiring has been shaped differently over time. And this brings us to the realization that emotions are not simply reactions to the present moment but also reconstructions of the past and projections into the future, such that the brain, in a single heartbeat, draws on stored memories to interpret a facial expression or a tone of voice, and then extrapolates to predict what might happen next, all while flooding the body with signals to prepare for action, whether that action is to embrace, to flee, to confront, or to withdraw. And in this sense, emotions serve as the brain's rapid, efficient decision-making tool, bypassing the slow, effortful reasoning process when urgency demands speed. Yet they are also susceptible to biases, distortions, and misfires, especially in a modern world where threats are rarely saber-toothed tigers but more often ambiguous social cues, economic uncertainties, or information overload, leading to chronic stress responses that wear down the immune system and alter brain function itself. And here we can trace the feedback loops where prolonged emotional states, such as anxiety or depression, physically change the structure and connectivity of neural circuits, reinforcing the very states that produce those changes. But there is also hope in the fact that positive emotions and mindful regulation can just as powerfully reshape the brain, enhancing resilience, increasing gray matter in key regions, and improving overall well-being, which points us to the immense potential of practices like meditation, cognitive reframing, and emotional literacy training to not only alter how we feel but to transform the architecture of the brain itself, reminding us that while we cannot always choose our initial emotional response, we can train ourselves to respond differently over time. And in this ongoing dance between biology and experience, nature and nurture, reflex and reflection, the brain that feels becomes the brain that learns, adapts, and evolves, turning the story of our emotions into not just a tale of survival but a chronicle of growth, connection, and meaning. The brain, in its ceaseless dance of chemistry and electricity, continues to weave emotions into the fabric of our lived reality. And as we move deeper into this exploration, we begin to see that emotions are not simply bursts of feeling but deeply layered patterns shaped by biology, memory, environment, and even the invisible pulse of culture around us. For every smile we wear and every tear that falls is underpinned by 1,000 unseen processes working in synchrony. From the release of oxytocin when we feel love to the sudden flood of cortisol when we are threatened. And what is fascinating is how the brain's ancient structures like the amygdala, thalamus, and hypothalamus communicate constantly with newer regions like the prefrontal cortex, creating a negotiation between raw instinct and measured thought, between impulse and reason. And this negotiation defines so much of who we are, how we react, and how we remember, for emotions are also time travelers. They carry echoes of our past into our present, influencing decisions, shaping our relationships, and even sculpting our personalities over the years, and yet they are never static, because as we grow, our emotional landscapes evolve. The storms of adolescence mellow into the more nuanced weather patterns of adulthood, while old fears sometimes fade or transform into wisdom. And to understand emotions fully, we must not only dissect the neuronal circuits but also listen to the narratives they create. For the brain is not just a laboratory of synapses but a storyteller, translating surges of dopamine into joy, or a lack of serotonin into shades of melancholy. And when we examine this through the lens of human connection, it becomes clear that emotions are also contagious. Mirror neurons allow us to catch the feelings of others, syncing our internal states to those around us, which is why a room filled with laughter can lift our spirits, while an environment thick with anxiety can weigh us down. And in the grand orchestration of existence, emotions are not flaws in the machinery of logic but essential guides, pointing us towards safety, pleasure, belonging, or growth. Yet they can also mislead, triggered by outdated fears or distorted perceptions, which is why understanding them is key to mastering our own lives. For when we can name our emotions, trace their origins, and recognize their patterns, we gain the power to respond rather than simply react, to choose our path with awareness rather than be carried away by the current. And this is where neuroscience meets philosophy, because the more we learn about the mechanics of feelings, the more we must confront questions about identity, free will, and meaning itself. Are we the authors of our emotions or merely the characters they animate? Are we steering the ship or are we passengers in the swells of chemical tides? And perhaps the answer lies in a balance, a dance between surrender and control, where we allow emotions to inform us without letting them define us entirely. And in doing so, we participate in the ancient human endeavor of turning sensation into story, reaction into reflection, and fleeting moments into enduring wisdom. Because at the end of the day, to feel is to be alive, and to understand feeling is to deepen the experience of living. And so, as the conversation between body and brain continues in this unbroken symphony, emotions become the invisible hand that guides almost every action we take, shaping not just what we feel, but how we see the world itself, filtering every experience through the delicate yet powerful fabric of our inner life. And while many imagine emotions as fleeting ripples on the surface of the mind, science reveals they are deep currents running beneath our thoughts, rooted in evolutionary survival, sculpted by personal memory, and modulated by chemical whispers from neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin, each one capable of altering the entire emotional landscape in mere seconds. And this dance is not just reactive. It is predictive, with the brain constantly simulating potential future states based on current sensations and past experiences, meaning we are often feeling things before the events that trigger them have even occurred. A phenomenon that explains why anxiety can creep in long before a speech, or joy can swell at the sight of someone walking toward you before they even smile. And as neuroscientists probe deeper into the limbic system, mapping the amygdala's rapid-fire alerts, the hippocampus's nuanced memory recall, and the prefrontal cortex's ability to weigh and reframe feelings, they uncover the startling truth that emotions are not isolated brain events but entire body phenomena, with the heart altering its rhythm, the gut adjusting its microbial balance, the skin shifting its electrical conductance, all in synchrony with the feelings rise and fall. And even more fascinating is how culture, language, and upbringing sculpt the raw biological potential into the emotional palette we live with, priming the body for fight or flight. Yet even here, culture and personal history color the experience, for the same racing heart and trembling hands might be labeled excitement in one context and panic in another, reminding us that emotions are both biological universals and deeply personal narratives. And as neuroscientists peer into the living brain with fMRI and EEG, they are finding that emotions are not confined to discrete centers, but emerge from vast networks, with the insula weaving together interoceptive awareness, the subtle knowledge of what is happening in the body, with the narrative self, making feelings feel like they are ours, while the anterior cingulate cortex acts like a bridge between emotion and action, detecting conflicts, signaling urgency, and nudging us toward resolution. And all of this unfolds within fractions of a second, before conscious thought even has a chance to form, which is why we can be moved to tears by a piece of music before we can articulate why, or why a stranger's smile can lift our mood without us ever knowing their name. And perhaps the most humbling insight is that emotions are not glitches in the machinery of reason but the very fuel of it, for decision-making without emotion, as tragically demonstrated in patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, becomes paralyzed, devoid of value-based judgment, proving that to feel is to know what matters, and to know what matters is to be fully alive. So as we explore deeper into this realm, we must see emotions not as the opposite of logic but as its partner, co-creating the tapestry of human consciousness in every waking moment. And as these intricate patterns of brain activity continue to weave the fabric of our emotional lives, it becomes increasingly clear that emotions are not random storms passing through an otherwise calm mind, but are deeply embedded processes that guide perception, shape decision-making, and even influence the body's health in subtle yet profound ways. For every surge of joy or stab of fear carries with it a cascade of hormonal changes, shifts in breathing, fluctuations in heart rate, and tiny, muscular adjustments that together create the embodied experience of feeling. And when we examine this through the lens of neuroscience, we see that these processes rely on a delicate interplay between the limbic system, particularly structures like the amygdala and hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex, which together form a kind of emotional circuit where raw affective responses are generated, evaluated, and regulated. Yet this interplay is not static. It is sculpted continuously by our experiences, memories, and cultural conditioning, meaning that no two people feel exactly the same way in identical circumstances because their neural wiring has been shaped differently over time. And this brings us to the realization that emotions are not simply reactions to the present moment but also reconstructions of the past and projections into the future, such that the brain, in a single heartbeat, draws on stored memories to interpret a facial expression or a tone of voice, and then extrapolates to predict what might happen next, all while flooding the body with signals to prepare for action, whether that action is to embrace, to flee, to confront, or to withdraw. And in this sense, emotions serve as the brain's rapid, efficient decision-making tool, bypassing the slow, effortful reasoning process when urgency demands speed. Yet they are also susceptible to biases, distortions, and misfires, especially in a modern world where threats are rarely saber-toothed tigers but more often ambiguous social cues, economic uncertainties, or information overload, leading to chronic stress responses that wear down the immune system and alter brain function itself. And here we can trace the feedback loops where prolonged emotional states, such as anxiety or depression, physically change the structure and connectivity of neural circuits, reinforcing the very states that produce those changes. But there is also hope in the fact that positive emotions and mindful regulation can just as powerfully reshape the brain, enhancing resilience, increasing gray matter in key regions, and improving overall well-being, which points us to the immense potential of practices like meditation, cognitive reframing, and emotional literacy training to not only alter how we feel but to transform the architecture of the brain itself, reminding us that while we cannot always choose our initial emotional response, we can train ourselves to respond differently over time, and in this ongoing dance between biology and experience, nature and nurture, reflex and reflection, the brain that feels becomes the brain that learns, adapts, and evolves, turning the story of our emotions into not just a tale of survival but a chronicle of growth, connection, and meaning. The brain, in its ceaseless dance of chemistry and electricity, continues to weave emotions into the fabric of our lived reality. And as we move deeper into this exploration, we begin to see that emotions are not simply bursts of feeling but deeply layered patterns shaped by biology, memory, environment, and even the invisible pulse of culture around us. For every smile we wear and every tear that falls is underpinned by 1,000 unseen processes working in synchrony. From the release of oxytocin when we feel love to the sudden flood of cortisol when we are threatened. And what is fascinating is how the brain's ancient structures like the amygdala, thalamus, and hypothalamus communicate constantly with newer regions like the prefrontal cortex, creating a negotiation between raw instinct and measured thought, between impulse and reason. And this negotiation defines so much of who we are, how we react, and how we remember, for emotions are also time travelers. They carry echoes of our past into our present, influencing decisions, shaping our relationships, and even sculpting our personalities over the years, and yet they are never static, because as we grow, our emotional landscapes evolve. The storms of adolescence mellow into the more nuanced weather patterns of adulthood, while old fears sometimes fade or transform into wisdom. And to understand emotions fully, we must not only dissect the neuronal circuits but also listen to the narratives they create. For the brain is not just a laboratory of synapses but a storyteller, translating surges of dopamine into joy, or a lack of serotonin into shades of melancholy. And when we examine this through the lens of human connection, it becomes clear that emotions are also contagious. Mirror neurons allow us to catch the feelings of others, syncing our internal states to those around us, which is why a room filled with laughter can lift our spirits, while an environment thick with anxiety can weigh us down. And in the grand orchestration of existence, emotions are not flaws in the machinery of logic but essential guides, pointing us toward safety, pleasure, belonging, or growth. Yet they can also mislead, triggered by outdated fears or distorted perceptions, which is why understanding them is key to mastering our own lives. For when we can name our emotions, trace their origins, and recognize their patterns, we gain the power to respond rather than simply react, to choose our path with awareness rather than be carried away by the current. And this is where neuroscience meets philosophy, because the more we learn about the mechanics of feelings, the more we must confront questions about identity, free will, and meaning itself. Are we the authors of our emotions or merely the characters they animate? Are we steering the ship or are we passengers in the swells of chemical tides? And perhaps the answer lies in a balance, a dance between surrender and control, where we allow emotions to inform us without letting them define us entirely. And in doing so, we participate in the ancient human endeavor of turning sensation into story, reaction into reflection, and fleeting moments into enduring wisdom. Because at the end of the day, to feel is to be alive, and to understand feeling is to deepen the experience of living. And so, as the conversation between body and brain continues in this unbroken symphony, emotions become the invisible hand that guides almost every action we take, shaping not just what we feel, but how we see the world itself, filtering every experience through the delicate yet powerful fabric of our inner life. And while many imagine emotions as fleeting ripples on the surface of the mind, science reveals they are deep currents running beneath our thoughts, rooted in evolutionary survival, sculpted by personal memory, and modulated by chemical whispers from neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin, each one capable of altering the entire emotional landscape in mere seconds. And this dance is not just reactive. It is predictive, with the brain constantly simulating potential future states based on current sensations and past experiences, meaning we are often feeling things before the events that trigger them have even occurred, a phenomenon that explains why anxiety can creep in long before a speech, or joy can swell at the sight of someone walking toward you before they even smile. And as neuroscientists probe deeper into the limbic system, mapping the amygdala's rapid-fire alerts, the hippocampus's nuanced memory recall, and the prefrontal cortex's ability to weigh and reframe feelings, they uncover the startling truth that emotions are not isolated brain events but entire body phenomena, with the heart altering its rhythm, the gut adjusting its microbial balance, the skin shifting its electrical conductance, all in synchrony with the feelings rise and fall. And even more fascinating is how culture, language, and upbringing sculpt the raw biological potential into the emotional palette we live with. Because while the machinery for fear, joy, anger, and love is universal, the way we interpret, express, and even notice them can differ radically between a child raised in a bustling Indian household where emotions spill into every conversation and one raised in a Scandinavian village where feelings are contained and understated. Yet in both cases the biological systems remain the same, waiting for the particular social environment to tune them, and modern imaging technology has begun to show how this tuning can literally rewire neural connections, with repeated emotional experiences strengthening certain pathways and weakening others, meaning that over a lifetime, our emotional brain is a living autobiography, carrying the traces of every heartbreak, every triumph, every moment of fear or awe, and if we understand this, we can begin to shape it intentionally, using tools like mindfulness to intercept the automatic cascade of stress hormones, or gratitude practices to slowly shift baseline emotional states. And as we do this, the boundary between biology and choice blurs, revealing that while we cannot choose what evolutionary hardware we were born with, we have an extraordinary power to influence how it is used, sculpting the very brain that feels into a wiser, kinder, more resilient version of itself. As we move further into the labyrinth of the brain's emotional architecture, it becomes clear that no single structure operates in isolation, but rather that emotions emerge from a vast web of interconnected neural networks, each communicating in whispers and electrical storms that span milliseconds yet shape lifetimes. And here we find that while the amygdala ignites the initial flare of feeling, be it fear, anger, joy, or desire. It is the prefrontal cortex that takes that raw surge and filters it through the lens of experience, morality, and foresight, deciding whether to amplify it into action or dampen it into quiet contemplation. And surrounding all of this is the hippocampus, weaving our memories into the tapestry of emotional response so that a scent from childhood can make us smile or a certain tone of voice can make our pulse race without our conscious permission. And this intricate triad is bathed in the invisible rivers of neurochemicals. Dopamine painting motivation into joy, serotonin stabilizing mood like a gentle hand, norepinephrine sharpening the senses in moments of urgency, and oxytocin building bonds that turn strangers into kin. Yet these are only the visible actors in a deeper drama, for beneath the molecular dance lies the evolutionary code that sculpted this machinery over millions of years, shaping creatures who could detect danger, nurture offspring, form alliances, and adapt to changing environments. And so our emotions are not just personal experiences but ancient survival tools, refined through trial and error long before language or reason existed. And when we study them, we are peering into the shared inheritance of all humanity, into the primal script that still governs our choices in the boardroom, the battlefield, the bedroom, and the quiet moments when we sit alone, lost in thought, and the paradox becomes apparent. That the same system that can inspire acts of extraordinary kindness can also drive humans to violence, that love and rage are siblings born from the same neural soil, and that the brain's gift of feeling is both a blessing and a burden, one that defines what it means to be human. And as we continue this journey, we begin to realize that understanding emotions is not merely a scientific quest, but a mirror in which we see ourselves more clearly, revealing that the brain that feels is, in truth, the brain that lives. And as we descend even deeper into this inner landscape, the threads of emotion start to reveal their hidden knots. For while the pathways seem clear in diagrams, in life they twist and loop in ways that defy neat categorization. And it is here that we confront the truth that feelings rarely arrive in pure form. Joy may carry the shadow of fear. Relief may come tinged with guilt. Love can spark jealousy. And even grief can hold moments of strange, bittersweet beauty, reminding us that the emotional brain does not work in binaries but in gradients, blending states like a master painter mixing pigments on an unseen palette. And this blending is shaped not only by biology but by the stories we tell ourselves, because the prefrontal cortex is not simply a judge of impulses but also a narrator, weaving raw sensations into meaning, framing a racing heart as excitement or dread, recasting a loss as tragedy or as a turning point. And in doing so it shows us that emotions are not fixed reactions but living interpretations, shifting with time, memory, and perspective. And perhaps the most fascinating truth here is that these interpretations do not just alter how we feel. They alter the very structure of the brain itself, for repeated emotional patterns strengthen certain neural pathways like well-worn trails through a forest, while neglected emotions fade into overgrown silence. And this neuroplasticity means that who we are emotionally is not a rigid fate but an evolving work, one we can sculpt deliberately through experience, reflection, and even deliberate practice in empathy or gratitude. And so, in the grand interplay between our ancient emotional circuits and our modern, reflective mind, we begin to see the possibility of not only understanding our feelings, but shaping them, guiding them like a river whose currents can be channeled without being entirely controlled. And it is here that the study of the brain that feels becomes more than science. It becomes an art, one that invites us to be both the subject and the artist, the experiencer and the shaper, of the ever-shifting canvas of human emotion. And so the exploration continues, stretching into the subtle territories where emotion is no longer just a reaction to the present, but a bridge between past and future, a phenomenon deeply tied to the way memory works, because when the hippocampus stores an event, it rarely keeps it in pure, factual form. It stores it colored by the emotions we felt at that moment, and later, when that memory is recalled, the emotional coloring comes back too, sometimes even stronger than the factual details themselves. And this is why a scent, a song, or a fleeting expression on someone's face can instantly pull us into a vivid emotional state as though no time has passed at all. For our amygdala responds far quicker than our rational mind, flooding us with the feeling before we can explain it. Yet this very mechanism that can bring joy and nostalgia can also be the root of anxiety and trauma, because the brain, in its drive to protect us, sometimes holds on too tightly to painful associations, keeping them raw and ready in case danger appears again. And here the prefrontal cortex must play the role of a compassionate editor, recontextualizing those memories, helping us distinguish between past pain and present safety, so that we can move forward without being shackled to echoes of what has been. But even as we heal and reshape these inner patterns, it becomes clear that emotion and cognition are not separate streams. They are one river with different currents, each influencing the other in every decision, every judgment, every leap of intuition. And when we begin to see this unity, the sharp line between thinking and feeling blurs, revealing that logic without emotion is directionless, and emotion without logic can be reckless. So the beauty of the human mind lies in the delicate dance between the two, a dance that has been evolving for millions of years and will continue to evolve as our lives, cultures, and relationships shape the way our brains respond to the world. For at the heart of it all, the brain that feels is not simply a biological organ. It is a storyteller, an artist, a guardian, and a constant companion, carrying within it both the storms and the sunlight of human experience. And from this realization, we begin to understand that emotions are not just private experiences but deeply social ones, woven into the fabric of our interactions, shaping the way we connect, bond, and even survive as communities, because the human brain is exquisitely attuned to the emotional states of others, reading the tiniest shifts in tone, posture, or gaze, often without conscious effort, and this sensitivity has been crucial for our species, allowing cooperation, trust, and empathy to flourish long before written language existed. For in those ancient days, the raising of an eyebrow, the tremor in a voice, or the quickening of breath could signal danger or safety, and entire groups depended on this nonverbal emotional intelligence to respond as one. Yet in the modern world, where digital screens replace many face-to-face moments, our brains still respond as though the person on the other side of a message or video is physically present, sparking hormonal changes, heartbeat shifts, and micro-expressions that echo ancient survival patterns. And here lies both a gift and a challenge. While technology can carry empathy across continents, it can also strip away the subtle cues our brains evolved to read, leaving room for misunderstanding, emotional isolation, or the dulling of our ability to truly feel with another. So to keep the richness of emotional connection alive, we must remain mindful of the spaces where our feelings are born and shared, seeking the warmth of real presence when we can, and recognizing that every meaningful relationship we hold is not simply built in the mind but etched into the brain's very architecture, altering neural pathways, strengthening certain synapses, and creating emotional maps that shape how we approach every future bond. And in this way, our emotional lives are living, breathing networks of connection, each thread tied to another human being, past or present, each tug felt across the web of memory and meaning that defines who we are. And as these threads weave tighter, the brain begins to form emotional patterns, habits of feeling, ways of interpreting the world that can either liberate us or confine us. Because the neural circuits involved in emotion are not fixed at birth but shaped by every interaction, every joy, every loss, and every moment of care or neglect we have ever known. Meaning that the story of your emotional self is not just a static record but a living script still being written, and the more we repeat certain emotional responses, the more those pathways strengthen, making it easier for the brain to default to them, which is why someone who has long lived in fear or anxiety may find it difficult to suddenly feel safe, just as someone who has cultivated gratitude and compassion can more easily summon them in times of stress. And this neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, offers both hope and responsibility, because while past trauma can etch deep grooves into our emotional reactions, deliberate practice, therapy, and mindful living can carve new paths, allowing us to rewrite parts of our emotional code. And here, science meets ancient wisdom. For long before neuroscience named the amygdala or prefrontal cortex, human cultures understood the importance of tending to the heart-mind, whether through meditation, storytelling, music, or rituals that helped transform pain into meaning. And what's extraordinary is that modern imaging now shows us the tangible changes in brain structure when we engage in these practices. The thickening of the prefrontal cortex with mindfulness, the dampening of overactive fear circuits through exposure and trust, the release of oxytocin when we embrace someone we love. And all of it reveals that emotions are not fleeting, ghost-like sensations, but physical forces reshaping the very machinery of our minds. reminding us that the way we feel today is both a reflection of yesterday and the blueprint for tomorrow, a living continuum in which every heartbeat and breath is another brushstroke on the vast canvas of our inner life. The human brain, in its silent elegance, has always been more than just a thinking machine. It is a living archive of every joy, every heartbreak, every pang of fear, every spark of desire we have ever felt, and in its labyrinth of cells and synapses lies the story of how emotions are not only born but nurtured, shaped, and transformed over the course of a lifetime. And to understand this is to step into a place where biology becomes poetry, where electricity becomes feeling, and where the raw chemistry of life translates into the private language of the soul. For deep inside the folds of the cerebral cortex, nestled beneath the vast wrinkled surface that gives humans our unmatched capacity for reasoning, sits the limbic system, a primal, ancient network that predates civilization itself, and within it, the amygdala stands like a vigilant sentinel, scanning the world for threats and pleasures alike, reacting in mere milliseconds to stimuli that the conscious mind has not yet had time to process, sending ripples of biochemical messages through the hypothalamus and pituitary glands to release hormones that quicken the heart, sharpen the senses, or, in moments of safety, soften the body into warmth and trust. And, alongside the amygdala works the hippocampus, keeper of memories, binding emotional reactions to the tapestry of our past, so that the scent of rain on dry soil might call forth the memory of a childhood afternoon, or the sound of a certain voice might flood the chest with nostalgia so intense it hurts. And yet this is only part of the symphony, for emotions are not solitary notes but chords struck across multiple regions of the brain, with the prefrontal cortex often stepping in as a wise conductor, tempering the raw impulses of the limbic system with judgment, empathy, and foresight, reminding us that not every fear must end in flight, not every anger must lead to conflict, and not every desire must be immediately fulfilled. And when these systems work in harmony, we find ourselves capable of subtle, complex feelings like compassion, bittersweet joy, or quiet pride, emotions that carry layers of meaning and cannot be reduced to the primal binary of pleasure and pain. And yet, the harmony is delicate, for trauma, chronic stress, or neurological disorders can throw this balance into chaos, leaving the amygdala hyperactive and the prefrontal cortex struggling to impose reason. A state where the world feels perpetually threatening, where even kindness is met with suspicion, where love is shadowed by the fear of loss, and here lies one of the greatest truths of human emotional life. That while emotions feel like pure instinct, they are in fact sculpted over time by our experiences, our relationships, and even the culture we are immersed in. For culture teaches us what it is acceptable to feel, when to show it, and when to hide it, shaping the neural pathways of emotion in much the same way repeated footsteps wear a trail into the grass. And so a child raised in an environment where tenderness is encouraged will develop a different emotional map than one raised where vulnerability is punished, and these maps, though not fixed, often guide our responses for decades, sometimes for life. And yet neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to rewire itself, offers hope that even the most deeply ingrained emotional patterns can be reshaped. For therapy, mindful practices, and healthy relationships can create new pathways, allowing the once fearful heart to learn trust again, the once closed-off mind to welcome joy, and the once restless spirit to find peace. And this process is not magic but biology, as neurons that fire together wire together, slowly replacing the reflexive loops of anxiety or despair with patterns of calm and optimism. And here, science meets something that feels almost spiritual, the idea that we are not forever bound by the emotions that once ruled us, that the brain is not a prison of old wounds but a garden capable of regrowth, if only we give it the right conditions. And to explore those conditions is to return again to the smallest building blocks of our emotional life. Neurotransmitters, those invisible messengers like dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and norepinephrine, each playing a distinct role in the great drama of feeling, with dopamine bringing the thrill of anticipation, serotonin lending the steadiness of contentment, oxytocin weaving the threads of trust and connection, and norepinephrine igniting the fire of alertness. And when these chemicals surge in balance, life feels vivid, purposeful, worth living. But when they falter, through genetics, stress, diet, or lack of meaningful connection, the emotional palate dulls, leaving the world feeling flat, joyless, or unbearably heavy. And yet, fascinatingly, the brain does not operate on chemistry alone. For the same chemical signal can produce wildly different emotional experiences depending on the thoughts, memories, and beliefs that accompany it, meaning that two people could feel the same rush of adrenaline and one might interpret it as excitement while the other experiences it as fear, a reminder that emotions are never just reactions to the outside world but deeply subjective creations shaped by the inner landscape of the mind. And perhaps this is why storytelling, art, and music have such profound power over us. They offer new frames for our feelings, reframing sorrow as beauty, fear as courage, and longing as love, and in doing so, they can actually change the way our brains process those emotions in the future, altering the patterns of neural activity and even the density of certain synaptic connections, proving that the line between psychology and neurology is far blurrier than we once imagined, and that the way we choose to interpret and express our emotions today can reshape the way we feel tomorrow, making the brain not just the organ that feels, but the organ that learns how to feel, and in that learning lies the quiet miracle of human resilience, the capacity to fall, break, despair, and yet rise again with a heart that still beats, still hopes, still reaches for meaning even when the world seems cold, because emotions, though born in biology, are sustained by something greater. The relentless will to keep living, to keep connecting, to keep feeling, no matter how many times the storm passes through. And so the dance of the brain and emotion continues, winding deeper into the intricate labyrinth of biology, memory, and meaning, where each thought becomes a thread in a tapestry too vast for conscious awareness to hold all at once. Yet somehow, we live inside it every moment without noticing, because to notice too much would overwhelm the delicate balance between feeling and functioning, a balance nature has sculpted over millions of years, honing reflexes and instincts that serve us before we even know they have acted, a balance where the amygdala flickers like an ancient signal fire, calling the body to attention, whispering of danger or delight, while the prefrontal cortex, ever the negotiator, steps in to weigh those raw impulses against the long arc of consequence, sometimes soothing the amygdala's urgency, sometimes amplifying it when survival truly hangs in the balance. And this interplay is never just about the present moment but also about the stored echoes of our past. The learned associations, the small patterns of experience that, brick by invisible brick, have built the emotional architecture of who we are, so that a simple smell can pull us into a memory 20 years gone. A voice can warm or wound us before we even parse its words. A certain slant of light can stir a melancholy we cannot name, all because the hippocampus has filed away these sensory traces alongside the feelings that once accompanied them, and now, when reawakened, they pour back into us. Not as facts but as living sensations, convincing us that the past is somehow present again. And in this, we see why emotions are not fleeting ephemera but living systems with their own logic, their own persistence, as real and impactful as any physical process in the body, because they are physical processes. Electrochemical storms sweeping across networks of neurons, hormones spilling into the bloodstream, muscles tightening or loosening in anticipation of what's to come, the heart adjusting its rhythm, the lungs shifting their pace, all in response to signals that originated not in the conscious mind but in the deep, ancient circuits that have been guiding living beings since before humans were humans, before mammals were mammals, back when survival meant reacting faster than thought. Yet even in our modern lives, where tigers rarely leap from the shadows, these same systems surge within us, shaping how we interpret a colleague's tone, a partner's silence, a stranger's glance, and because they move faster than reason, they can define the story we tell ourselves about what is happening before reason has a chance to intervene. Which is why understanding how emotions are born is not just an academic curiosity but a key to understanding our choices, our relationships, our health. For unmanaged emotion can become chronic stress, flooding the body with cortisol until it wears down the immune system, the heart, the mind's resilience, while skillfully managed emotion can sharpen judgment, deepen connection, and even extend our lives. And this is why cultures across time have built rituals, art forms, philosophies, and therapies aimed at navigating the inner tides, from the breath-focused stillness of meditation to the communal catharsis of music and dance, from the confessional release of storytelling to the disciplined reframing of cognitive behavioral practice, all of which, in their own way, Acknowledge that while the brain may give rise to emotion, emotion, once born, reshapes the brain, forging new neural pathways with every feeling fully felt. And this feedback loop means that our emotional lives are not fixed but fluid, capable of being trained, expanded, healed, and refined, if only we can learn to meet them not as enemies to be conquered but as messengers to be understood, because in the end, emotions are the language of the body speaking to the mind, and when we listen with both curiosity and compassion, we gain not only self-knowledge but also a deeper empathy for the unseen battles and joys playing out in every other human being we meet, reminding us that beneath the surface of every life, there is a brain that feels, a heart that remembers, and a story still unfolding in the quiet theater of the mind. As the orchestra of emotional life plays on within the brain, it becomes evident that our feelings are not isolated sparks but rather continuous streams that ebb and flow, weaving themselves into the ongoing narrative of our existence, shaping our choices before we are even aware that a choice has been made, whispering subtle biases into our thoughts, coloring the world with hues drawn from the deep wells of memory and instinct, and often, we move through life thinking we are steering the ship of our decisions, when in truth, much of the rudder is gripped by the quiet, unseen hands of emotion, guiding us away from danger, toward comfort, sometimes toward growth, sometimes toward retreat, and every emotional ripple begins somewhere. In the amygdala's rapid alerts, in the hippocampus's quiet comparisons to past events, in the hypothalamus's delicate hormonal cues. And as these signals move through neural pathways, they gather meaning and weight. They are amplified or softened depending on context, like music that swells to match the scene of a film. And it is this fluidity that makes emotions both a gift and a challenge, because they are neither fixed nor purely rational. Rather, they are living processes, influenced by the time of day, by the scent of the air, by whether you are hungry, by the tone of someone's voice, by the micro-expressions you catch in their eyes before they speak, and scientists now understand that these emotional currents are not simply psychological, but deeply physiological, tied to the body's rhythms and states, heart rate, breathing patterns, gut signals, even the tension in your muscles. And this is why you can feel nervous without knowing why, or find yourself smiling before you've even identified the thought that caused it, because the body often senses and reacts before the conscious mind catches up. And in a way, emotions are like early warning systems and navigational tools rolled into one, constantly scanning the environment and your internal state to help you adapt, survive, and connect, and yet, they are also capable of overwhelming the system, leading to spirals of anxiety or waves of joy that seem to defy logical explanation. And to truly understand the birth of emotion, we must look not only at neurons firing in the brain but at the entire feedback loop between brain and body, at the role of neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, each adding its own flavor to the emotional palette, at the hormones like cortisol and oxytocin that can sharpen fear or deepen love, and perhaps most intriguingly, at the way social and cultural experiences shape the very architecture of the brain, so that the emotional world of one person may be utterly different from another's, even if they share the same biology, because the emotional circuits are plastic, rewiring over time, adapting to repeated patterns, and this is why trauma can leave an emotional imprint that lingers long after the event, why joy in early life can create a resilience that carries through decades, why the comfort of a familiar lullaby can still soften the edges of grief, and when we reflect on how emotions are born, it becomes clear that they are not created in isolation but in the interplay between brain, body, and environment. A constantly updating story where your past informs your present, where a smell from childhood can bring tears to your eyes, where a sudden rush of adrenaline can sharpen your senses in an instant, and where, beneath it all, the same ancient systems that kept our ancestors alive still pulse in us, shaping every heartbeat, every breath, every choice, and every connection we make, so that to understand emotion is to understand the human condition itself. For in the end, the brain that feels is not separate from the brain that thinks. It is the same brain, alive with meaning, memory, and the endless, beautiful complexity of being human. The journey into the emotional brain flows onward like a river deep beneath the surface of everyday thought, carrying with it currents of memory, perception, instinct, and the delicate chemistry that turns experience into feeling, for emotions are not random sparks in the dark. They are shaped, sculpted, and refined by millions of years of evolution, etched into the architecture of the mind so deeply that every glance, every word, Every heartbeat is soaked in their influence. And as we drift deeper into this world, we begin to see how an emotion is not born in a single place but emerges from a network. A symphony of regions working in concert, the amygdala standing vigilant as the sentinel for threat and safety. The hippocampus painting the backdrop with memories of the past, the hypothalamus subtly pulling levers that change our heartbeat, breathing, and the flood of hormones in our bloodstream. The prefrontal cortex stepping in to judge, to plan, to weigh the meaning of what we feel against the goals we have and the future we seek. And surrounding all of this is the vast sensory apparatus that continually pours in information from eyes, ears, skin, tongue, and nose, a ceaseless stream of data that must be sorted, filtered, and interpreted before the mind can even decide what is happening, much less how to feel about it. And in this sorting process, ancient circuits in the brainstem and limbic system whisper to us before we even realize it, telling us this is dangerous or this is safe, this is good or this is bad. With a speed so fast it bypasses language, and yet this instant reaction is only the seed of emotion, for the conscious mind will then take that seed and weave around it a story, an explanation, a personal meaning, and it is here that culture, upbringing, and personal history leave their signature, shaping whether a racing heartbeat becomes excitement or fear, whether tears mean grief or relief, whether the touch of another is welcome or unwanted. And this interplay between raw instinct and reflective thought creates the endlessly varied landscape of human feeling. A landscape that is never static but constantly reshaped by what we learn, by the bonds we form, by the challenges we face, so that the same event can feel utterly different at different times in our lives. And this plasticity is both a gift and a curse, for it allows us to heal from emotional wounds, to reframe old pains into sources of wisdom, but also leaves us vulnerable to cycles of anxiety, depression, and self-doubt that can become entrenched if the mind rehearses them too often. And as science peers deeper into the biology of this process, we find that emotions are not merely products of the brain in isolation. They are embodied, tied to the state of the heart, the gut, the muscles, the immune system, each sending signals back to the brain that alter our emotional state in real time, so that the quickened pulse and shallow breath of fear can actually amplify the feeling itself, just as a relaxed breath and softened shoulders can calm it. And this feedback loop between body and mind means that emotion is never purely mental nor purely physical, but a living conversation between the two, one that can be influenced from either side. And here lies the subtle art of emotional regulation. Not the suppression of feeling, which only buries it alive, but the ability to meet it with awareness, to recognize the first stirrings before they swell into a storm, to breathe, to move, to speak, to think in ways that shift its course. And the more we practice this art, the more we discover that emotions are not chains binding us to instinct but currents we can learn to ride. And in riding them we may discover new depths of empathy, new strengths of resilience, for every emotion carries within it information. Fear signals the need for safety. Anger points toward boundaries crossed. Sadness honors what was lost. Joy celebrates what is present. And even shame, often seen as toxic, can in its healthy form guide us toward alignment with our values. And by listening to these messages without becoming enslaved to them, we gain the freedom to respond rather than merely react, to create rather than be carried. And in this way, the brain that feels becomes the brain that understands, that chooses, that shapes its own inner, whether even in the face of outer storms. For though the machinery of emotion is ancient, the capacity to work with it consciously is one of the most extraordinary powers we possess. A power that grows not from denying our feelings but from exploring them, tracing them back to their roots, and realizing that they are not flaws in the system but the very signals that keep us alive, connected, and human. And so as we walk further into this labyrinth of neurons and neurotransmitters, we are not merely studying biology. We are stepping into the living heartbeat of what it means to be alive. And so the brain, ever weaving its tapestry of feeling and meaning, continues its ceaseless dance between biology and experience, between the primal urges written deep in the hypothalamus and amygdala and the lofty interpretations crafted in the prefrontal cortex. A duet of ancient instinct and modern reflection. And as each moment passes, countless electrical storms ripple through neural networks, carrying with them whispers of memories, fragments of sensory impressions, and the echoes of emotions long past yet still alive in the subtle chemistry of the mind. For emotions are not fleeting apparitions that appear and vanish in isolation but rather waves in a vast ocean of consciousness, shaped by tides of neurotransmitters, the gravitational pull of hormonal rhythms, and the winds of external events that stir the surface, and when a scent catches you unexpectedly, transporting you instantly to a childhood room bathed in afternoon light. That is the limbic system quietly opening a door to the past, letting you step back into a moment that no longer exists in the physical world yet remains vibrantly real in your mind. Because the brain does not merely store events as static records but as living, evolving networks of meaning, enriched or eroded each time they are recalled. And every recall is not just retrieval but recreation. The memory subtly altered by the emotional lens of the present moment, so that joy can make an old sorrow seem lighter, and pain can cast a shadow over a memory once bright, and this fluidity is both a gift and a challenge, for it allows us to heal by reshaping the past yet also warns us that our recollections are never purely objective. And in the great web of neurons, the connection between emotion and survival becomes clear. For long before we had language to name our feelings, fear kept our ancestors alive in the presence of predators. Love bound families and tribes together for mutual protection. Anger rallied courage to defend against threats, and curiosity pushed us to explore beyond the safety of familiar territories. Each emotion an adaptive tool, honed over countless generations. Yet in the modern world, these ancient tools are often unsheathed in contexts they were never designed for, so that the same flood of adrenaline meant to help us escape a charging beast now surges when we read an email that challenges our competence, and the brain cannot always tell the difference between a predator in the grass and a perceived threat to our social standing, reacting with the same urgency because it is wired for survival, not nuance. But the marvel of our evolved mind is that we can learn to observe these emotional surges, to recognize them not as absolute truths but as signals, data points in the grand experiment of living. And when we practice mindfulness or reflective thinking, we give the prefrontal cortex a chance to step into the driver's seat, slowing the reflexive responses of the amygdala, allowing space for choice rather than compulsion, and in that space, transformation becomes possible. For emotions are not fixed destinies but shifting currents we can navigate. And just as a sailor reads the wind to adjust the sails, so too can we learn to work with our feelings, to turn fear into caution, anger into determination, sadness into empathy, and joy into connection. And as the day unfolds, we are each the author of a story written in sensations, reactions, and meanings. A story that is not simply happening to us but one we can influence with awareness and intention. For the brain that feels is also the brain that learns, adapts, and dreams, and every heartbeat, every breath, is an invitation to participate consciously in the creation of our emotional world, shaping it not only for ourselves but for the countless others whose lives we touch, because emotion is not contained within the skull. It radiates outward in our words, our gestures, our choices, and in doing so, it shapes the collective emotional climate of families, communities, and even nations. And perhaps the greatest realization is that to understand how emotions are born is to understand not just the mechanics of the brain but the essence of what it means to be human, to live not as machines of logic but as beings who feel love, fear, hope, and create meaning in a universe that offers none by default. For meaning is the child of emotion and thought intertwined, and in this vast interplay, the brain remains both the stage and the performer, forever engaged in the art of feeling. The brain is not a static machine processing cold logic. It is a living ocean of electricity and chemistry, a restless tide where thought and feeling are woven so tightly together that to separate them would be to destroy their meaning. And as we continue exploring this ocean, we realize that every wave of emotion begins somewhere small, perhaps with the flicker of a sensory signal or the whisper of a memory drifting up from the deep. Yet that flicker becomes a storm because of how the brain's networks transform raw data into living experience. And so, we pass through the amygdala once again, not as tourists but as diverse, descending into the pulsing coral reefs of fear, joy, anger, and love. Each coral branch a cluster of neurons that have been sculpted by evolution to respond to the cries of an infant, the shadow of a predator, the warmth of sunlight, or the echo of a familiar voice. And from there we move into the hypothalamus, the command center for the body's visceral orchestra, where hormones are released like messengers running into the bloodstream carrying urgent news. Run now, eat now, hold this person close. And every part of the body listens because emotion is not just something in the head. It is something that takes over the skin, the heart, the gut, and the breath, pulling the self into alignment with the needs of survival or connection. And yet, in the cerebral cortex, especially the prefrontal regions, a quieter conversation is happening. One that evaluates, predicts, and restrains, turning raw emotional surges into nuanced expressions, rage into assertiveness, lust into affection, grief into art. And this dialogue between ancient instinct and modern reasoning is what makes human emotions so rich, so paradoxical, and so often overwhelming. For we are built to feel everything at once and to make meaning of those feelings even when they contradict each other. And that is why a single tear can contain both sorrow and gratitude, why a laugh can hide fear, and why love so often carries the seeds of loss. But beneath all of this complexity, there is a fundamental truth. Emotions are the body's way of telling the brain what matters, and the brain's way of telling the body what to do about it. And this loop runs continuously, shaping every choice, every memory, and every dream. And when we lie in bed at night staring into darkness, thinking we are lost in thought, we are in fact drifting through emotional landscapes carved by a lifetime of experiences, some bright, some shadowed, all stitched together in patterns too intricate to consciously untangle. And yet, these patterns guide us more than any rational calculation ever could, pulling us toward some people, pushing us away from others, drawing us to art, to music, to moments of beauty we can't quite explain. Because somewhere deep down the brain recognizes that to feel is to live, and without emotion thought itself becomes hollow, like a map with no terrain. And perhaps this is why the most brilliant ideas often emerge from states of intense feeling. Newton's awe at the falling apple, Van Gogh's anguish in his fields of swirling stars, a mother's fierce determination to protect her child, because emotion ignites the mind's creative fire, binding attention, sharpening memory, and pushing the self beyond comfort into the unknown. And so, in studying how emotions are born, we are not merely learning neuroscience, we are uncovering the script of what it means to be human, a script written not in words but in electrochemical rhythms that pulse through the brain's 86 billion neurons, a script that began long before our species existed, when ancient creatures first learned to move toward what helped them survive and away from what could kill them, and that primal binary, approach or avoid, has evolved into the symphony of human feelings. Yet the notes remain the same, only the instruments have changed. And so as we continue this journey into the brain that feels, we begin to see that emotion is not an accessory to thought but its foundation, not an obstacle to reason but the very soil from which reason grows. And in the quiet moments, when we listen closely, we can almost hear the brain's hidden music, the low hum of life itself reminding us that to be alive is to feel, and to feel is to be endlessly, beautifully, vulnerably human. The human brain, in its intricate complexity, operates not just as a machine of logic and survival, but as a cathedral of feelings, where every stone, every stained glass window, is built from the electrochemical whispers between neurons. And if we trace these whispers to their origins, we find that they are not random sparks in the darkness, but deliberate ripples across a living ocean, shaped by millions of years of evolution to guide us toward pleasure, warn us against pain, and anchor us in the deep currents of social connection. For without emotion, thought becomes sterile, stripped of meaning, like a sentence without a story, and in this vast labyrinth of the mind, there exists a constant negotiation between the primal and the profound, the limbic system roaring with the immediacy of hunger, fear, and desire, while the prefrontal cortex attempts to interpret these roars into language, into strategy, into something we can act upon without drowning in them. But the truth is that these two worlds, instinct and reason, are not separate kingdoms at war, but two wings of the same bird, and when they move together in harmony, our flight through life feels purposeful, graceful, even transcendent. Yet when they fall out of sync, when the amygdala floods the body with signals of threat and the rational mind scrambles to respond, we can find ourselves locked in spirals of anxiety, rage, or sorrow, unable to tell whether the danger is real or just a shadow. And perhaps what makes this dance so fascinating is that emotions are not fixed sculptures in the brain, but living organisms, constantly reshaping themselves with every memory, every heartbeat, every breath we take, such that the grief you feel today is not the same as the grief you felt 10 years ago. It has aged. It has acquired a new accent, it wears different clothes. Yet its core remains familiar, like an old friend whose face you could recognize in any crowd. And when we look deeper, we see that emotions are built from three interwoven threads. The physiological changes in the body, the interpretations we give them, and the expressions we allow to escape into the world, and each thread is as important as the others, for without the quickening of the pulse, joy would not make us feel alive. Without the story we tell ourselves about that quickening, we might misinterpret joy for fear. And without the expression, a smile, a laugh, a tear, the emotion might remain trapped within, unshared and unprocessed. And herein lies the beauty and the tragedy of the brain that feels. It is both a private theater and a public square, a place where silent performances unfold behind closed curtains, and yet where some moments burst forth into open sunlight, changing the course of relationships, decisions, even entire lives. Think of how a single look from a loved one can make your chest warm as if a small sun has been lit inside you, or how a certain song can send a shiver down your spine, summoning memories so vivid they blur the boundaries between past and present, as if your brain has folded time to bring you back to a place you thought was gone forever. And in these moments we glimpse the truth, that emotions are not just biochemical signals, but portals, transporting us into alternate versions of reality where the logic of numbers and reason gives way to the logic of the heart. And this is why every culture, every language, has built myths, poetry, and rituals around feelings, because they are the invisible threads that hold societies together, enabling empathy, cooperation, and trust. Yet, in the same breath, we must admit that emotions are double-edged. For the same passion that inspires art can also ignite conflict. The same loyalty that binds a family can also blind one to injustice. And the same courage that drives a revolution can also feed a war. And perhaps this is why the brain has evolved not to erase emotions, but to regulate them, to modulate their intensity so that they can serve us without consuming us. A task carried out by delicate neural circuits linking the limbic system to the higher cortical areas. Circuits that are shaped and reshaped by our experiences, our environment, and even the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. For identity itself is an emotional construct, a patchwork quilt of remembered joys, sorrows, fears, and hopes stitched together into the narrative we call me. And this narrative is not fixed but fluid, changing with each new chapter of life, which means that the brain that feels is also the brain that rewrites, constantly editing and reframing the script of our existence. But here lies the paradox. While emotions are fleeting by nature, arising, peaking, and fading, they leave behind traces, imprints in the neural pathways, so that even when the feeling itself is gone, its echo remains, shaping our future perceptions and responses in ways we are often unaware of, like a faint scent that lingers in a room long after the flowers have been removed. And it is in these echoes that we often find the deeper truths about ourselves, truths we might resist or deny, yet which continue to whisper in our dreams, our habits, our sudden flashes of intuition. And so, to understand the brain that feels is to understand that we are not merely passengers in the vehicle of emotion, but also its navigators capable of learning how to steer, slow down, or accelerate when needed, and this skill, emotional intelligence, is as vital to survival as logic or memory, because it allows us to live not just efficiently, but meaningfully, to savor joy without clinging to it, to face pain without being destroyed by it, and to remain open to the ever-changing landscape of the human heart. For in the end, the brain that feels is not a weakness to be overcome, but the very essence of what makes us human, and if we were to strip it away, leaving only cold calculation, life would lose its color, its music, its warmth, becoming nothing more than an equation solved and forgotten, whereas with emotion, even the smallest moment, a shared laugh, a tearful goodbye, the smell of rain after a long summer, becomes a treasure, a fragment of eternity we carry within us, proof that we are alive. The brain, in its astonishing architecture, does not simply process emotions as discrete, isolated events. Rather, it weaves them into the vast tapestry of our lived experience, connecting them to memories, bodily sensations, and even unconscious predictions about the world around us, creating a dynamic feedback loop that shapes not only how we feel but also how we interpret reality itself. And this intricate interplay begins deep in the limbic system, where the amygdala, hippocampus, and hypothalamus engage in a kind of ceaseless conversation, the amygdala scanning the environment for threats or Rewards, the hippocampus linking those emotional moments to past experiences, and the hypothalamus sending chemical signals that trigger physiological changes, such as an increased heart rate or the release of stress hormones, all of which happen in milliseconds and often before we are even aware of them. Yet emotions are not merely reactions. They are also constructions, assembled by the brain using prior knowledge, context, and sensory input to generate an internal narrative that feels instinctive but is, in many ways, a prediction about what might be happening, and this predictive processing is why two people can look at the same event, a dog running toward them, and one might feel joy while the other feels fear, because their brains have, over years of experience, built different emotional maps for interpreting the world, and these emotional maps are in constant flux, shaped by social interactions, cultural norms, hormonal changes, and even the microfluctuations of neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, which together can tilt our mood, enhance bonding, or trigger withdrawal. And it is here, in this biochemical dance, that we find the intimate link between brain and body, for emotions are not confined to neural circuits alone but ripple outward into muscles, organs, and the immune system, altering posture, facial expression, and even the way we digest food. And fascinatingly, the brain does not simply register these bodily changes. It listens to them, using interoception, the sense of the body's internal state, to refine its emotional predictions, meaning that a racing heart can intensify feelings of anxiety or excitement depending on the story the brain tells about why it is racing. And this is why techniques like deep breathing, meditation, or mindfulness can shift emotional states. They alter the body's signals, which in turn reshape the brain's interpretation. And yet, while much of this happens beneath conscious awareness, the prefrontal cortex offers us a window of influence, allowing us to regulate, reframe, or even suppress certain emotions through deliberate thought, though this effort is neither easy nor always successful, for the emotional brain, honed by millions of years of evolution, is designed to prioritize survival over accuracy. And this survival bias explains why negative emotions like fear, anger, or sadness often feel more intense and more memorable than positive ones. Our ancestors who quickly noticed threats lived longer than those who lingered too long in comfort, and so our modern brains still give disproportionate weight to danger signals, even in environments where those threats are more symbolic than physical. But herein lies both the challenge and the opportunity. For by understanding the brain's emotional machinery, we can learn to navigate its biases, to cultivate gratitude, resilience, and empathy not as vague ideals but as neural habits, strengthened through repetition and conscious practice. And when we do this, we are not merely controlling emotions but reshaping the networks that give rise to them, engaging in a kind of emotional neuroplasticity that can, over time, change not just how we feel but who we are, for our identities are, in no small part, the sum of the stories our brains tell about our emotional lives. And as we continue to explore this landscape, through neuroscience, psychology, and lived experience, we uncover the profound truth that emotions are not obstacles to reason but essential guides to meaning, giving color, urgency, and texture to every choice we make, every relationship we nurture, and every dream we dare to pursue, reminding us that to be human is not merely to think but to feel, and in feeling, to truly live. And as we journey further into the labyrinth of the brain's emotional architecture, it becomes clear that emotions are not fixed entities but rather dynamic processes, continuously shaped and reshaped by the interplay of perception, memory, and bodily signals, each surge of feeling being both a reaction to the present moment and an echo of past experiences. So that when we feel joy, the amygdala not only sparks with recognition of something rewarding but also recruits the hippocampus to search through our personal archive for similar moments, weaving the present into the tapestry of the past. And when we feel fear, the hypothalamus primes the body for survival, accelerating the heartbeat, sharpening the senses, while the prefrontal cortex weighs the danger against the context, sometimes calming the amygdala's alarm and sometimes amplifying it if the threat is deemed significant. And this constant dance between neural regions creates a feedback loop where emotions influence thoughts, and thoughts in turn modify emotions, meaning that the smile we force onto our face can, through the motor cortex and facial nerve feedback, genuinely begin to soften our mood, just as dwelling on a past hurt can rekindle the physiological arousal of anger or sadness, showing us that feelings are not only born but also sustained or dissipated by our mental focus. And as researchers have uncovered, neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine act as the chemical messengers fine-tuning this entire process, with serotonin stabilizing mood and enhancing social confidence, dopamine infusing experiences with a sense of reward and motivation, and norepinephrine adding urgency and alertness, all of them released in different patterns depending on whether we are in love, in danger, in despair, or in awe, which suggests that emotions are as much a biological symphony as they are a psychological narrative. A composition in which genes provide the score but life plays the melody, improvising through every interaction, loss, and triumph. And even more fascinating is the fact that the brain does not passively receive the world's emotional cues but actively constructs them, predicting what should be felt based on prior models of reality, so that in ambiguous situations our brain fills in the gaps, sometimes misreading neutral faces as hostile or seeing kindness where there is none, an ability that, while adaptive for quick decision-making, can lead to misunderstandings and even conflict, yet this same predictive coding allows for the beauty of anticipation, the warmth we feel before meeting a loved one, the thrill before a performance, all of which demonstrate that emotions are not simply born in the moment but can exist in the space before the moment arrives. And in this light, we see how profoundly emotions guide our lives, shaping the stories we tell about ourselves, dictating our choices, influencing our relationships, even determining how we remember the past and envision the future. For a memory tinged with happiness can feel brighter than it truly was, while one wrapped in sorrow can seem darker and heavier than reality, revealing that emotions are both our most honest compass and our most deceptive narrator, leading us toward connection, creativity, and survival, yet also sometimes into the shadowy alleys of bias, fear, and regret. And it is here, in this duality, that the human experience finds its richness, because to feel deeply is to live fully, and the brain that feels is not merely a biological machine. It is an artist, a historian, and a dreamer, painting the world in colors we can never quite prove exist, yet without which life would be nothing but a cold and silent monochrome. And so the story of the feeling brain winds deeper, through corridors of thought and layers of ancient instinct, as if we were tracing the roots of a vast underground tree that has been growing for millions of years beneath our consciousness, each tendril and root representing a connection between sensation, memory, and the invisible spark we call emotion. For the truth is that what we experience as joy, sorrow, fear, love, anger, or peace is never just a surface event. It is the orchestration of countless microscopic interactions, neurotransmitters leaping across synaptic gaps, electrical pulses traveling down neural highways at extraordinary speeds, and glial cells providing silent but essential support to the very network that makes feeling possible. And within all this, the amygdala serves as a kind of rapid response sentinel, scanning our world for threats or opportunities before we are even aware of them, while the prefrontal cortex, that grand planner and reflective thinker, tries to modulate and interpret these signals, weighing them against context, experience, and long-term goals. Yet the interplay between these regions is far from mechanical. It is dynamic, fluid, and deeply shaped by the unique biography of each individual, so that no two people will feel the same emotion in precisely the same way. For one person's fear may be another's thrill, one person's sadness another's sense of peace, and even within a single life, the same external event can produce entirely different feelings depending on the state of mind, physical health, or even the hormonal fluctuations of that moment. And when we step back to observe this process, we begin to see emotion not as an inconvenience or a weakness, but as an essential evolutionary advantage, a guiding compass that helps us navigate a world that is too complex to be understood through logic alone. For without emotion, decisions lose their urgency, meaning becomes abstract, and the very motivation to act begins to fade. Yet our modern lives sometimes challenge this ancient system, bombarding it with stimuli it was never designed to handle. Social media providing constant microdoses of social comparison and validation seeking, notifications tugging at our attention like impatient children, news cycles feeding a steady diet of fear and outrage, and in such an environment, the emotional circuits can become overstimulated, dysregulated, and, in some cases, hijacked entirely, leaving us in states of chronic anxiety, simmering anger, or numb detachment. But understanding how emotions are born offers us a kind of map, a way to see where we are vulnerable and where we can intervene, whether that means practicing mindfulness to slow the automatic reactions of the amygdala, building habits of reframing to shift the stories our prefrontal cortex tells, or cultivating environments and relationships that feed the emotions we want to experience more often, because in the end, emotions are both sculptors and sculptures. They shape our behavior and are shaped by it, and this feedback loop can spiral downward into despair or upward into resilience and joy, depending on how we engage with it. And perhaps the most astonishing realization is that emotions are not locked within our private skulls. They are contagious, transmitted through micro-expressions, tone of voice, posture, and even the synchronization of heartbeats and breath between people, meaning that the feelings we carry are never just our own. They ripple outward into families, communities, and even strangers passing on the street, and so learning to understand and work with our emotions is not merely a personal project, but a social responsibility. For each time we bring awareness, compassion, and regulation into our own feeling life, we contribute to a larger atmosphere in which others can do the same, and in this way, the birth of an emotion is not just a biological event. It is a moment in the great unfolding story of human connection, a story that began long before us and will continue long after, carried in the shared language of the brain that feels. And so the intricate dance of the brain's emotional circuitry continues, weaving a narrative that is as ancient as life itself yet as personal as your own heartbeat. For emotions are not random visitors to the mind but carefully choreographed signals that carry the legacy of millions of years of would vanish, robbing us of the instinct that once saved our ancestors from the snapping jaws of predators. Without the hippocampus, the sweetness of a remembered smile would fade into the void. Without the prefrontal cortex, impulse would reign and consequence would be forgotten. And so this triad, along with countless supporting actors in the brain's vast theater, gives rise to the rich and volatile spectrum of human feeling. Yet what makes this truly astonishing is not merely that it exists, but that we can know it exists, that consciousness can turn its gaze inward and watch the machinery at work, observing how a simple scent can resurrect decades-old memories, how a passing glance can ignite desire, how a single sentence can wound or heal in equal measure, and in that observation, we find both power and vulnerability. For to know our own emotions is to stand in the middle of a storm and be aware of every drop of rain, to be both the sailor gripping the wheel and the ocean itself. And perhaps this is why emotions, though born of biology, transcend it, spilling into art, poetry, music, and the thousand ways humans have tried to make sense of their invisible tides. For while an fMRI might show the glow of activated brain regions, it cannot capture the ache of longing, the quiet peace of a child asleep in your arms, the surge of pride when you stand where you once feared to tread, and so the science of emotions must walk hand in hand with the lived experience of them, each enriching the other, because without the human story, the data is just numbers, and without the data, the story is just a rumor, and together they reveal that to feel is to be alive in the truest sense, to be a creature forever shaped by the interplay of memory and prediction, chemistry and choice, instinct and reflection, where every moment is both a product of the past and a rehearsal for the future. And in this continuous unfolding we see that emotions are not interruptions to rational thought. They are the very soil from which rationality grows, the primal motivators that gave birth to reason itself. For long before we could measure or quantify, our feelings guided us, pulling us toward warmth, pushing us away from danger, nudging us toward connection, and those same ancient signals, dressed now in the complex clothes of modern life, still steer our days, making the brain that feels not just an organ of thought, but the beating heart of who we are, an endlessly creative, adaptive, and unpredictable force that defines our humanity even as it binds us to the animal world from which we emerged. And so the dance of the emotional brain continues, an endless interplay between the intricate circuits of biology and the intangible essence of human experience, where every flicker of feeling is both a chemical spark and a story written in the language of our lives, where joy may be a gentle sunrise spilling warmth into our chest, yet beneath it lies a cascade of dopamine and serotonin, surging in the synaptic gaps between neurons, weaving together the sensation of delight with the memory that anchors it, and sadness may feel like a gray sky pressing upon the heart, but within the folds of the brain, it is the amygdala signaling a loss, the hippocampus replaying moments we can't let go of, and the hypothalamus sending waves of hormones that make the chest ache, reminding us that emotions are not just thoughts. They are embodied experiences that ripple through every cell, from the tense grip of our stomach muscles when fear approaches to the slowing of our breath when love makes us feel safe. And in these responses, ancient survival patterns echo. For long before we wrote poetry or painted canvases, our ancestors relied on this system to navigate the dangers of the savannah, to sense threat before it appeared, to bond deeply with kin for protection, to be driven by hunger or attraction toward the continuation of life itself. And over millennia, these primal mechanisms evolved into the rich spectrum of feelings we know today, capable not only of protecting us but also of inspiring music, art, philosophy, and acts of compassion. Yet still, in the quiet recesses of the limbic system, they remain rooted in the same neural loops that once kept a small band of humans alive against impossible odds. And perhaps this is why emotions can feel both timeless and overwhelming, because they are not merely reactions to the present moment but a conversation with all of human history encoded in flesh and electricity. And as the prefrontal cortex learns to interpret and regulate these signals, we develop the ability to pause before action, to transform rage into words, longing into song, grief into ritual, which is the essence of what it means to be human. A creature with the body of an animal and the mind of a storyteller, translating molecular events into meaning. Yet the brain is not a static machine, it is a living, shifting architecture where new experiences carve fresh pathways, where repeated emotions strengthen neural highways until they become default routes for our responses. And this is why the person who often chooses gratitude finds it easier to feel it again, why the one who lingers in resentment may feel its pull more quickly next time, for neurons that fire together wire together, shaping the inner landscape of our emotional life. And so, every day we are in a quiet dialogue with our own brain, training it even when we don't realize, deciding through what we focus on, what stories we tell ourselves, what memories we replay, what emotional patterns will define us tomorrow. And if we could peer deeply into this process, we would see that each feeling is not an isolated spark but part of a symphony in which the thrum of the heart, the flush of the skin, the rush of breath, and the flow of neurotransmitters all rise and fall in rhythm. And when we say we are happy or afraid or in love, we are describing not a single event but an entire state of the organism, a holistic chorus of body and brain, shaped by evolution, culture, and personal history. And this understanding gives us both humility and power. Humility because we see that we are never fully in control of what we feel, and power because by changing our habits, our environment, and our interpretations, we can slowly reshape the very circuits from which our emotions arise, guiding them toward resilience, empathy, and joy so that, over time, we become co-authors with our biology, sculpting the architecture of the mind that feels. And perhaps this is the true miracle of the brain, that it can be both the stage for emotions and the director of their future, holding within its folds the ancient fire of survival and the modern capacity for transcendence, endlessly weaving the raw data of the senses into the living fabric of human meaning. And so the story of the brain that feels continues, its intricate web of emotional architecture stretching further into the unknown, as we consider the profound ways in which our inner world shapes not only how we perceive the outer world but how we act upon it, how we love, how we fight, how we create, and how we survive. Imagine for a moment that every color, every sound, every scent you experience is not a neutral sensation but a thread woven into the grand tapestry of your emotional history, a tapestry that stretches back not just through your childhood but through the evolutionary epochs of our species, carrying with it the fears of our ancient ancestors crouching in the tall grass, the joy of finding a safe clearing with food and warmth, the grief of loss when the tribe loses one of its own, and the elation of victory when danger is overcome. Because at its core, emotion is not a luxury or an embellishment of the mind. It is the primal compass by which we navigate the uncertainty of existence. This is why your heart might race when a shadow moves too quickly in the corner of your eye, even in the safety of your modern apartment, because deep in the amygdala there is no distinction between the rustle of a predator's paw on ancient soil and the flutter of a curtain in an air-conditioned room. And yet, beyond these primal signals, there is a symphony of higher processing. Your prefrontal cortex weighing the odds, your hippocampus comparing this moment to thousands of stored memories, your insula quietly monitoring the interoceptive map of your body so that you feel your feelings not as abstract concepts but as living, breathing sensations in your gut, your skin, and your bones. And as this orchestra plays, you are not just a passive listener but an active conductor, subtly changing the tempo with your thoughts, your focus, and your interpretations, which is why two people can stand in the same place, hear the same words, and yet leave with entirely different emotional realities. The science here is breathtaking, because modern neuroimaging shows that even our anticipation of emotion can create the physiological effects of the emotion itself. Your body will release cortisol simply because you expect something stressful, your dopamine will spike just because you anticipate a reward, and this anticipatory loop often drives human behavior more than the actual events do, which means our emotional lives are as much about imagination as they are about reality. A truth poets have understood for millennia but science has only recently confirmed, and if you extend this to the scale of relationships, you begin to see how the shared construction of emotional meaning between lovers, between friends, between cultures, forms the very foundation of cooperation, trust, and belonging, and how its breakdown can lead to isolation, resentment, or even conflict on a massive scale, because when our emotional languages no longer align, we become strangers even to those we once knew intimately. But here's the paradox: emotions, for all their raw power, are also malleable, sculpted by repeated experience, by deliberate reframing, by mindfulness practices that teach us to watch feelings without becoming them, and by the slow rewiring of the brain's plastic networks, which means that even the deepest-seated fear or grief can, over time, be reshaped into something new, something lighter, perhaps even something that empowers rather than imprisons us. And when we recognize this, we start to see that the brain that feels is not just a relic of evolutionary survival but a living artist, painting our days with shades we can choose to blend or contrast, to darken or brighten, depending on how well we've learned the craft of our own emotional palette. A craft that is never finished. For as long as we live, the brush is still in our hands, and the next stroke is always ours to make. And so the journey of understanding the brain that feels continues, diving deeper into the labyrinth of our inner worlds, where every neuron seems to hum with the music of life, and every fleeting sensation threads itself into the tapestry of who we are. For emotions are not merely reactions to the outside world but intricate creations born from the alchemy of our biology, experiences, and meaning-making processes, beginning as raw sensory inputs: light, sound, touch, taste, smell, that travel into the thalamus, the great relay station of the brain, which filters and directs them toward the limbic system, especially the amygdala, whose watchful vigilance determines whether a stimulus is safe or dangerous, igniting the fight-or-flight response in a heartbeat if it senses threat, sending signals down to the hypothalamus to trigger adrenaline, cortisol, and a cascade of physiological changes: racing heartbeat, quickened breath, sharpened senses. Yet emotions are never purely physiological. They are also stories we tell ourselves, shaped by the prefrontal cortex, where raw feelings meet thought and reflection, and here, in this meeting place, joy can bloom from a simple smile, sadness can swell from a remembered loss, and anger can rise from a perceived injustice, because the mind takes what the body feels and weaves it into a narrative, a meaning, a context, and in that weaving, the feeling becomes more than a fleeting burst of chemicals. It becomes part of our identity, and as we move through the hours of the day, these emotions ripple and shift like tides, responding to subtle cues we hardly notice. The scent of a childhood home, the distant sound of a familiar song, the way a stranger glances at us in passing. And each of these micro-experiences is evaluated by a brain always on alert, always interpreting, always deciding what matters to survival, belonging, and selfhood, so that even in moments of stillness, the mind is a theater of silent dramas, with the hippocampus archiving emotional memories, linking them to the past so the next similar situation will be recognized faster, allowing us to respond with learned wisdom or with old wounds. And here lies the paradox. Emotions that once evolved to keep us alive can sometimes bind us, because the amygdala cannot always tell the difference between a predator in the bushes and an argument with a friend, reacting with equal urgency, flooding the body with stress hormones that, if prolonged, can wear us down, damage health, and distort perception, and so emotional intelligence becomes not a luxury but a survival skill, teaching us to step back, breathe, and observe our feelings as signals rather than absolute truths, to see that fear may be caution or it may be a shadow from the past, that sadness may be loss or it may be longing for connection. And in this awareness, the prefrontal cortex can soothe the amygdala, calm the storm, and redirect the mind toward clarity, compassion, and purposeful action. For the brain that feels is also the brain that learns, adapts, and grows, rewiring itself with every emotional encounter, strengthening some neural pathways, pruning others, and making it possible for to evolve not just as individuals but as communities, because emotions are contagious. Mirror neurons in the premotor cortex allow us to feel echoes of what others feel, binding us together through shared laughter, shared tears, shared fear, shared hope. and this resonance has been the glue of human survival, drawing us into tribes, families, and societies where cooperation could flourish. Yet it is also the source of collective passions that can inspire revolutions or fuel conflicts. And so, understanding the brain that feels is to understand humanity itself, to see that every handshake, every smile, every raised voice is the visible tip of an iceberg of neural activity and lived history, that inside each person there is an ocean of feeling constantly shaped by biology, memory, environment, and imagination, and perhaps the most extraordinary truth is that emotions are not fixed. They shift, evolve, and can be consciously cultivated, for practices like mindfulness, gratitude, and compassion training have been shown to physically change brain structures, increasing gray matter in areas related to emotional regulation and empathy, while reducing the hyperactivity of fear centers, meaning that we are not prisoners of the emotional patterns we inherited or developed early in life, but rather artists of our inner landscapes, capable of painting them with new colors, expanding them with new horizons, and softening them with new understandings. And in this lies both responsibility and freedom. Responsibility to tend to our inner worlds so they do not harm ourselves or others, and freedom to shape a life that feels not only deeply but wisely, where the intensity of the storm is matched by the strength of the anchor, and where every emotion, from the sharpest pain to the sweetest joy, becomes not a burden to escape but a messenger to listen to, guiding us toward a fuller, richer experience of what it means to be human. And so the exploration deepens, for emotions are not isolated sparks but flowing rivers that carve valleys in the mind's landscape, shaping not only how we feel in the moment but how we remember, how we decide, and even how we dream, because the brain does not treat emotions as separate from reason but as the very framework through which reason operates, with each experience tinged by a color of feeling that determines its importance, its urgency, and its place in our mental archives, meaning that joy and sorrow are not just fleeting visitors but architects of our inner world, building pathways that guide our choices long after the moment has passed. And this is why a song that once played during a first love can still cause the heart to race decades later, or why a certain street corner can suddenly tighten the chest with grief. The amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex work together like a triad of ancient storytellers, one encoding the raw pulse of the event, another archiving it with sensory detail, and the last weaving it into the ongoing narrative of who we believe we are. And within this weaving lies a truth that is as humbling as it is empowering. That we are never simply rational creatures navigating a neutral reality, but beings of layered perception whose every plan, ambition, and interaction is tinged with the memory of feelings felt before, so that even in a negotiation or a scientific experiment, we are guided by subtle emotional undercurrents, some of which rise from our evolutionary past where fear kept us alive, desire kept us reproducing, and belonging kept us from being abandoned by the tribe, and though the modern world no longer holds saber-toothed tigers at the edge of the forest, the brain still responds to social rejection as if it were a mortal threat, still releases the same chemical cascades when love blooms as when survival once demanded bonding, which is why heartbreak can physically ache in the chest and why laughter in a crowded room can dissolve stress more effectively than solitary meditation, because emotions are embodied. They are not just in the mind but in the gut, in the heartbeat, in the skin's tingling, in the way muscles tense or relax without conscious command, and neuroscience now reveals that the so-called gut feeling is not a poetic metaphor but a measurable dialogue between the enteric nervous system and the brain, sending signals that influence decision-making before the prefrontal cortex has even begun its logical analysis, suggesting that our choices are often made in milliseconds based on emotional appraisal and only later justified with reason, which explains so much about human history, art, and even conflict because people rarely go to war or fall in love through reason alone. It is the fire of feeling that moves armies, that inspires poetry, that drives revolutions, and as we dive further into the biochemistry of this fire, we encounter dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, norepinephrine. The alchemists of mood, the invisible hands that paint our internal weather, so that a surge of dopamine can make a mundane idea feel like a stroke of genius, while a drop in serotonin can turn a sunny day into a gray, lifeless expanse. And yet, despite their power, these chemicals are not tyrants but messengers, shaped by our environment, our habits, and even the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, meaning that the way we interpret a setback, as a personal failure or as a challenge to grow, can change the emotional and chemical outcome, rewiring not only the moment but the pathways that determine our future resilience. And thus the study of emotions is not just about understanding the brain but about understanding how to live, how to steer the currents of feeling without denying their force, how to harness joy as fuel, to transform fear into focus, to let grief deepen compassion rather than calcify into bitterness. Because in the end, emotions are the texture of existence, the music to which every step is taken, and if we learn to listen closely, to feel without drowning, to act with awareness even when the waters rise high, then perhaps we can move through life not as victims of our emotional storms but as skilled navigators who understand that the same waves that can sink a ship can also carry it to new worlds. And so the story of the brain that feels continues, winding ever deeper into the labyrinth of neurons, synapses, and chemical whispers that define the essence of human emotion. For if we pause and consider the delicate interplay between biology and experience, we find that each feeling is neither purely an instinct nor solely a learned response, but rather a symphony woven from countless micro-interactions, where neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and oxytocin act not as mere chemicals, but as tiny messengers that shape our joy, our sorrow, our fear, and our love, moving through synaptic gaps at lightning speeds, binding to receptors like keys fitting into locks, triggering cascades of electrical activity that ripple through the amygdala, hypothalamus, and prefrontal cortex in ways that turn a fleeting thought into a pulse-quickening rush or a calming sigh. And as these signals travel, they pull threads from memory stored in the hippocampus, combining them with real-time sensory input from the thalamus and the sensory cortices, so that the smell of rain is never just the smell of rain. It is the memory of walking home from school, soaked but laughing, the weight of the books in your backpack, the chatter of friends, the feeling of being young and free, and in that instant, the brain doesn't simply process data, it resurrects a world, making the past and the present coexist in the fragile space of a heartbeat, while simultaneously predicting the future by sending quiet signals to the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, asking, what does this mean for me now and what should I do next? For this is the adaptive magic of emotions. They are not idle states, they are survival tools honed over millions of years, pushing us to act, to avoid harm, to seek safety, to forge bonds, to care for our young, to defend our kin, to reach for the stars when logic alone would hold us back. And this, perhaps, is where the human brain begins to transcend the simple animal mind. For in us, emotions are not only reactions. They are reflections capable of being examined, questioned, shaped, even resisted, and yet they can still take the wheel when urgency demands it, as when fear overrides thought to pull us back from the edge of a cliff or when love blinds us to danger for the sake of another's well-being. And as neuroscientists peer deeper into the workings of this emotional machinery, they uncover not just the circuitry, but the constant conversation between body and mind, the signals from the gut microbiome to the vagus nerve, the subtle adjustments of heart rate and hormone release, the ways in which posture and breath can alter the emotional tone of a moment. And this interplay creates a feedback loop where emotion changes physiology and physiology changes emotion, explaining why forcing a smile can actually lift a mood, why deep breathing can quell panic, and why stress can make the body physically ill. And here lies one of the great paradoxes. Emotions are intensely personal, yet they are also profoundly universal, for across cultures, across time, across every human society ever known, the same core emotions, joy, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, disgust, emerge in strikingly similar patterns, their expressions etched into the muscles of the face, their recognition hardwired into the visual centers of the brain, allowing us to understand each other without words, a gift that has bound humans together long before the birth of language. And yet, while the framework is universal, the details are endlessly unique, sculpted by upbringing, culture, personal history, and even momentary circumstance, so that the joy you feel at a sunset may be tinged with nostalgia while for someone else it is pure serenity. And in this vast diversity of inner worlds, the brain acts as both artist and audience, forever creating and forever reacting, seeking patterns, finding meaning, attaching significance where perhaps none objectively exists, but where subjectively everything exists, because to feel is to be alive, to assign value, to know without words, that some moments are worth holding on to forever. And so the science of emotion is not merely about mapping brain activity or tracing biochemical pathways. but about understanding the very fabric of what it means to be human, about seeing that behind every tear, every laugh, every quickened heartbeat, there is a complex story being told in electrical pulses and chemical waves, a story that began before you were born, shaped by the genes you inherited and the womb that carried you, refined by every experience you have ever had, and still being rewritten with every breath you take. And if we follow this thread far enough, we begin to see that emotions are not interruptions to thinking. They are the foundation of thinking, the silent architects of decision-making, the invisible hand that guides the logic we believe to be pure reason. For even the most rational choice is colored by emotional weightings that we may never consciously notice. And in this truth lies the quiet, humbling realization that to truly know the brain, we must honor the heart, not as a literal organ of feeling, but as the symbolic seat of our emotional lives, the place where science meets poetry, where neurons meet meaning, and where, in the end, the brain that feels is the brain that makes us who we are. The human brain continues to weave its intricate symphony of electrical impulses and chemical signals. It becomes clear that emotions are not simply fleeting moods or abstract feelings. They are deeply rooted biological events shaped by millions of years of evolution, each one a carefully honed survival mechanism that has helped our species adapt to an ever-changing environment. And to truly understand this process, we must follow the journey from the first flicker of sensory perception to the final conscious experience of emotion. Starting with the thalamus, the brain's relay station, which receives a flood of incoming sensory data from our eyes, ears, skin, nose, and tongue, rapidly filtering and directing it toward the relevant processing centers, visual information to the occipital lobes, sounds to the auditory cortex, tactile sensations to the somatosensory strip. But crucially, some of this sensory input takes a fast track to the amygdala, the almond-shaped cluster buried deep within the temporal lobes, bypassing the slower cortical routes, allowing for rapid emotional responses to potential threats before the conscious mind even has time to deliberate, which is why a sudden shadow might cause you to jump before you realize it's just a swaying branch. From there, the amygdala, acting as the brain's emotional alarm bell, sends signals to the hypothalamus, initiating a cascade through the autonomic nervous system. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream. The heart rate accelerates, breathing quickens, and muscles tense, priming the body for fight or flight. Yet this primal surge is only one half of the equation, for the prefrontal cortex steps in, evaluating context and drawing upon memory, logic, and social norms to modulate the raw intensity of the amygdala's reaction, deciding whether the situation truly warrants panic or if it can be resolved with calm reasoning. Meanwhile, the hippocampus, nestled beside the amygdala, retrieves relevant memories that give emotional coloring to the current experience, perhaps reminding you of a past encounter that shapes your reaction in subtle but profound ways. And the insula, often overlooked yet vitally important, integrates signals from the body, translating physiological states, like a racing heart or churning stomach, into subjective feelings of anxiety, excitement, or dread, meaning that emotions are as much about what happens in the body as in the brain. At the chemical level, neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and GABA interact in a delicate balance, influencing not only mood but also how intensely and how long we feel certain emotions, and hormones like cortisol, oxytocin, and testosterone add additional layers of influence, shaping stress responses, social bonding, and aggression. What makes all of this extraordinary is how these processes, though grounded in biology, are also shaped by culture, upbringing, and personal experience, such that two people can experience the exact same event and yet feel entirely different emotions. One perceiving a roller coaster ride as thrilling joy, another as stomach-twisting terror, because their brains interpret the sensory and bodily signals through unique mental filters built over a lifetime. This interplay of biology and personal narrative means that emotions are both universal and deeply individual, a paradox that has fascinated philosophers and scientists for centuries. And as modern neuroscience advances, tools like fMRI and EEG allow us to watch the brain's emotional circuits light up in real time, revealing patterns and networks that were once invisible, while computational models are beginning to map the staggering complexity of how billions of neurons cooperate to produce a single tear, a laugh, or a sigh. But for all this knowledge, there remains a mystery: why do we feel at all? For from an evolutionary standpoint, emotions clearly serve adaptive purposes, guiding behavior toward survival and reproduction. Yet they also color our lives with meaning, art, and poetry, leading to acts that have little to do with survival in the strict sense. Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that emotions are the glue between thought and action, giving value to our decisions and driving us toward goals, relationships, and experiences that define the human condition. And so when we say the brain feels, we are really saying that the brain creates a dynamic, ever-shifting theater where perception, memory, physiology, and culture converge, shaping each moment of our conscious lives into something more than mere data. It becomes a story, one we live and rewrite, with every heartbeat. And so, as we bring this journey to a close, we can step back and see the mind not just as a processor of information or a cold, calculating organ, but as a living, breathing storyteller, weaving together the threads of sensation, memory, and meaning into the rich tapestry of what we call emotion. Every heartbeat, every breath, every flicker of a neuron carries with it the imprint of both our biology and our lived experience. The joy that lights up our face, the sorrow that pulls at our chest, the anger that ignites our will. These are not accidents, nor are they weaknesses. They are the profound language of a brain evolved to connect, to protect, to learn, and to adapt. We are creatures of feeling, not in spite of our intelligence, but because of it. Without emotions, logic loses its compass. Without feelings, choices become hollow. From the primitive surges that guided our ancestors' survival to the nuanced shades of empathy and compassion that define human culture today, emotions have shaped not just our internal world, but the very course of history. And as science continues to decode the mysteries of how emotions are born, we stand at the edge of a new understanding, one where we can nurture healthier minds, build deeper relationships, and even harness our emotional lives to create a better future. But perhaps the greatest insight of all is this: emotions are not just something that happen to us. They are something we participate in, shape, and share. They are the invisible bridge between self and other, the pulse of our humanity, and the reason our lives have depth, beauty, and meaning. And in that truth lies the final heartbeat of our story, the recognition that to understand the brain that feels is to understand ourselves.